"This car costs more than your whole neighborhood. Don't tell me you know how to fix it." Marcus Hale scoffed beside the smoking Bentley. Officer Doyle shoved a flashlight close to Aisha's face, sneering. "Papers? People like you only know how to steal cars." She didn't back down. She didn't speak. Her oil-stained hand rose, and the ring on her finger gleamed so brightly it left Marcus speechless. What started as humiliation flipped in an instant. The ones laughing now trembled before the truth. Never underestimate someone. You might be mocking justice itself. Late in the afternoon on a desolate mountain road, the sunset faded behind rows of pine trees. The sky darkened, and the wind whipped through the cliffs, creating a sharp, eerie howl that blended with the sound of a choking engine. A sleek silver Bentley sat stranded halfway up the slope, hood flipped open, white smoke pouring out like a dying beast. Marcus Hale, a familiar face among the upper class, was behind the wheel, gripping it so hard his knuckles turned white. He yelled into his phone, calling number after number, but the signal kept cutting out. No one answered. No one came. The smugness usually carved into his face had given way to frustration. A man used to being served, to luxury rides and five-star service, now stood helpless as smoke poured from his car. The silver Bentley, worth a fortune, was suddenly nothing but scrap. Marcus slammed the steering wheel. The sound echoed through the still air. He stepped out, leather shoes crunching against gravel, eyes scanning around for someone to unload his anger on. But the road was deserted, lined only with the long shadows of trees stretching in the dim light. As he muttered curses under his breath, a figure approached from a distance. At first, it was just a dark shape, but through the smoke and dust, it became clear. A black woman, solidly built, carrying a heavy toolbox. Her steps were steady, her eyes locked on the car. Aisha Rowe, the woman, stopped next to the smoking hood and placed the toolbox on the ground. Her breathing was calm. She showed no fear or hesitation in front of a man whose wealth and image radiated arrogance. She bent slightly to look at the engine, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Marcus narrowed his eyes, sizing her up from head to toe. His lips curled into a faint smirk. He took in the faded flannel shirt, the dusty jeans, the worn-out toolbox, and spoke in a mocking tone, loud enough to cut through the mountain silence. "This car costs more than your whole neighborhood," Marcus said, voice laced with contempt. "Don't tell me you know how to fix it." The words landed thick in the smoke-filled air, adding weight to the tension. To Marcus, the idea of a black woman walking up to his luxury Bentley was absurd. He was used to technicians in clean white uniforms at premium garages, used to throwing money at problems. Aisha, to him, was an uninvited nobody, and her presence felt like an insult. Aisha didn't respond right away. She quietly lifted the lid of her toolbox and picked out a wrench that fit her hand just right, the motion practiced and sure. She knew exactly what Marcus meant. His words were blunt with disdain, but her silence hit back harder than any argument. Marcus cleared his throat, mistaking the quiet for submission. He leaned against the car, eyes cold, waiting to see what this lesser person would dare to do with his million-dollar machine. The air tightened for a few breaths. The soft clink of metal tools from the box blended with the wind. Aisha tilted her head slightly, peering into the engine bay. Smoke swirled around her, but her gaze stayed calm, picking up every mechanical detail with practiced ease. The stillness in her contrasted sharply with Marcus's growing unease. He adjusted his suit jacket and frowned, irritated that she showed no fear, no confusion. "What are you doing? Don't ruin my car," Marcus snapped, his voice sharp, masking worry with arrogance. Aisha looked up and met his eyes without a hint of hesitation. "The engine won't start because the fuel line is clogged. The spark plugs need checking, too. It's just steel and wires, not magic." "Oh." Marcus froze for a moment, thrown off by the certainty in her voice. He pressed his lips together, then let out a short, bitter laugh. In his mind, what Aisha said sounded like pointless arrogance. A black woman, on a deserted mountain road, daring to speak to Marcus Hale, a millionaire groomed by gala dinners and boardroom spotlights, it was laughable. He smirked. "You understand Bentleys? That's cute." Aisha didn't bother answering. She leaned back down and began loosening a few bolts, her movements quick and precise. Marcus crossed his arms and watched, caught between disdain and curiosity. He hadn't expected that, in the quiet of the mountains, an unknown woman would face him with such composure. And while he believed this was just a meaningless moment, it was in fact the beginning of a story he couldn't imagine. The sun dipped lower, its last light flickering through the smoke, catching the edge of a silver ring on Aisha's hand each time she moved. Marcus caught the glint but looked away, assuming it was cheap. He didn't know that tiny detail would become the turning point. On what seemed like a random stretch of mountain road, a smoking luxury car, a frustrated millionaire, and a calm black woman fixing an engine, everything appeared coincidental. But every word, every glance, and that fleeting gleam from her ring was weaving a thread of conflict, pulling truth to the surface in a way no one could expect. Aisha exhaled softly, her calloused hand gripping the hood lever. With a smooth motion, the hood popped open, a wave of heat pushing the white smoke to scatter. She leaned in to observe, fingers tapping quickly along a few connectors, her voice calm. The engine is just steel and wires, not magic. The words rang clear through the thick air, heavy with fuel and oil, a statement of quiet confidence. Marcus stood slightly behind her, arms crossed, pale blue eyes glinting with sarcasm. He let out a dry laugh. Someone like you understands a Bentley? That's rich. He emphasized, someone like you, drawing a hard line, then leaned against the door, tapping his finger on the polished paint, amused and dismissive, waiting to see what would happen next. The sound of tires, crunching gravel, cut through the moment. A white patrol car with blue stripes rolled to a slow stop nearby. Red and blue lights flashed through the smoke, making the scene look even more surreal. Two white officers stepped out. Marcus recognized the posture immediately: dominant stares, crooked smirks. One placed a hand on his hip, eyes fixed on Aisha, then said with casual contempt, "Well, this looks about right." A black girl bent over a luxury car. Laughter erupted from both of them, echoing through the trees, and making the tense air even heavier. Aisha stayed focused, her fingers tracing a loose rubber hose, not flinching. But the words hovered like an invisible slap. Marcus gave a faint smirk, not because he found it funny, but because the mockery made him feel supported. The taller officer, Kane, took a step forward, dragging out his words. "Careful, Marcus. She might be taking off with your wheels." Marcus laughed out loud, not because he believed it, but because the idea of siding with men in uniform reinforced his own sense of superiority. Aisha slowly raised her head, eyes cutting sharply through Kane, then back to Marcus. She didn't reply right away. The silence hollowed the air, turning their snide laughter into something awkward and forced. Then she spoke, voice low but edged with steel, every word filling the space between them. "You keep the car still, I'll handle the rest." The moment stiffened. Even the wind whistling through the pine branches seemed louder. Marcus frowned, unsettled by her directness. He was used to deference, to bowed heads, and polite requests. Now, in front of him stood a woman he believed belonged to the forgotten, cutting through his assumed authority with one sharp line. Kane rolled his eyes toward Doyle, the second officer, then burst out laughing, as if he'd just heard the most absurd joke. Doyle joined in, voice sneering. "Marcus, you've got guts letting someone like that touch your treasure. That car's worth more than her lifetime salary." Marcus let out a sharp breath through his nose but stayed still. A hint of hesitation flickered within him as his eyes drifted down to Aisha's hands, moving steadily as she tightened a few bolts. Despite the taunts, her movements weren't clumsy, they were practiced, efficient. That detail irritated him even more because he couldn't deny the truth. She might actually understand this engine better than he did. Kane stepped closer, dragging his heavy boots across the gravel on purpose. He leaned near the hood, breath laced with tobacco, voice offhand but sharp like a blade. "Listen. This engine is worth more than anything you've ever touched in your life. Don't think that rusty toolbox puts you on the same level." Aisha slowly tightened the wrench in her grip, her eyes still fixed on the engine, but her words cut through the air, cold and clear. "Value isn't in the object, it's in how people treat each other." Silence stretched. Marcus swallowed hard. Doyle raised an eyebrow, and Kane smirked, but the smirk faltered when he saw there was no fear in Aisha's eyes. The air thickened, as if some invisible current had passed between them. Marcus turned toward Kane, forcing a strained smile, trying to salvage a sense of agreement. "Let them talk. At least it gives me something to do while I stand here. The car's been dead an hour already. There's nothing left to lose." But deep inside, something unsettled was growing. He wasn't sure if it was the officer's mockery or Aisha's calm presence that bothered him more. For the first time, he felt a shift, like maybe the person he had just looked down on was the one holding more control in this moment than he did. The evening grew darker. Patrol lights flashed across their faces. Kane kept smirking, but there was scrutiny behind his eyes. Doyle stood by the rear corner of the car, arms crossed, watching Aisha's hands with focus. Marcus clenched his fingers, exhaled slowly. On that silent mountain road, where only an engine should have been heard, there was now a collision of prejudice, mockery, and challenge. What began as empty words had sparked a conflict that was quietly gathering force, ready to explode into something no one expected. A harsh beam from a flashlight hit Aisha's face directly, exposing every line on her sweat and dust-streaked features. Doyle gripped the flashlight tightly, holding it like a weapon. The relentless light made Aisha squint, but she stood straight, hand firmly holding the wrench. His voice came dry and deliberate, dragging out each word like a verdict. "Papers? This car isn't yours." His breath, laced with stale coffee and cigarettes, pressed in close, making the air feel suffocating. Aisha took a slow breath, pushing down her discomfort, then replied firmly, not loud but clear, "I'm not driving. I'm helping him." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Marcus, a living witness standing right there. But Marcus stayed silent, arms crossed, gaze cold and detached, irritated by the situation but unwilling to step in. He watched, waiting to see how she would handle it, and part of him seemed amused, as if his silence let him stay above the mess, untouched. Doyle clenched his jaw, sweeping the light down her neck to her chest, then back up to her face. "Someone like you knows how to help?" he sneered. "You look more like a thief than a good Samaritan." He stepped closer, boots grinding against gravel with a crunch that sent a chill up the spine. Kane stood behind, arms folded, watching with a crooked grin, as if enjoying a cheap show. Marcus sighed, irritation plain in his eyes, but still said nothing, letting the tension stretch. Aisha blinked, her brows drawing together. She lowered the wrench, resting it lightly on the edge of the hood, and answered with steel in her voice. "I told you, I'm helping him fix the car. If you think otherwise, say it. Don't hide behind that light." Doyle flinched slightly, caught off guard by her steady tone. He was used to lowered eyes and stammered excuses, not direct defiance. Marcus's expression tightened, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. He didn't want to get involved, but her icy composure stirred something unexpected in him. There was something about Aisha that unsettled him, though he wouldn't admit it, something that didn't match the kind of women he was used to brushing aside with a check or a cold glance. The air thickened, the mountain wind no longer enough to cut the tension. Doyle lowered the flashlight slightly, but his hand stayed tight, eyes still fixed on Aisha like a threat. Kane gave a short laugh, his voice mocking. "Maybe we've got ourselves a new mechanic, Doyle. Let her tinker a bit, see if she can turn that Bentley into scrap." His laughter bounced off the cliffs, echoing like a drawn-out insult. Aisha turned her head, eyes cutting from Kane to Doyle, her lips pressed into a hard line. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp, slicing through the drawn-out standoff. Doyle raised an eyebrow, amused by her refusal to back down, but instead of answering, he pushed the flashlight closer again, the beam stinging Aisha's eyes. She didn't flinch. Her grip on the wrench tightened, breath sharp but heartbeat steady. Marcus stared at the scene in front of him, frustration rising fast. He clenched the lapel of his suit jacket, his mouth opening, then closing again. He wanted to get out of there quickly, wanted the car fixed, wanted silence back, but pride held him back from defending Aisha. He didn't want to be seen as standing on the same side as a black woman he had just belittled. Doyle slammed the flashlight hard against the hood, the metal clanging loudly and sharply, sending thicker smoke rising from the engine bay. "I'll say it one last time. This isn't your car. If you don't show paperwork, I'll treat you as a suspect." His voice carried a clear threat. Aisha gave a slight smirk, thin and cold as ice. "I'm not the one who needs to prove anything. The owner is standing right there. But maybe you'd rather chase shadows than face the truth." In that moment, Kane and Doyle glanced at Marcus, waiting for a reaction. Marcus kept his arms crossed, face tight, eyes uncertain. He felt himself standing on a line if he stayed silent. He silently endorsed the humiliation. If he spoke up, he had to admit she had value in this situation. But his arrogance led him to choose silence, letting the tension build unchecked. The air on the mountain road now felt like a taut wire, ready to snap with the slightest pull. Doyle still held the flashlight, its beam tracking along Aisha's hand. Kane chuckled softly, fingers tapping on his holster. Aisha didn't flinch. Her eyes locked in, sharp and steady, glowing in the darkness settling around them. And in that exact moment, the first clash drew a hard, irreversible line on one side, power dressed in a police uniform. On the other, a woman carrying calm and a weight no one yet understood. Aisha leaned in, half her body inside the smoking engine bay, the stench of burnt oil and scorched metal thick in the air. Her hands were slick with grease, sweat rolling down her cheek and dripping onto the heavy wrench. The engine crackled and popped like it was on the edge of exploding, but she didn't flinch. To Aisha, every mechanical part had its own language. You just had to be patient enough to listen. As she tightened a loose bolt, Kane suddenly burst out laughing, his voice hoarse, laced with the cruelty of someone used to wielding power. "Nice fake ring," he said loudly, making sure Marcus could hear. "Looks like something straight off a flea market table." The words cut through the tense air like a blade, ready to spark a fire. Doyle followed up with a mocking smirk, his eyes flicking to Aisha's grease-covered hand where the silver ring still glinted in the dark. It wasn't an ornate piece, but the light it gave off had a strange pull, like it was hiding something beneath the grime and dust. Marcus hesitated. His eyes lingered on the ring, drawn to the sharp gleam. For a second, curiosity replaced his irritation. He knew jewelry, he knew what was real and what wasn't, and that light wasn't from cheap metal. But he said nothing. He swallowed the thought, letting his eyes shift away to preserve his aloofness. He didn't want to admit he had noticed something remarkable in the hand of the woman he had just dismissed. Aisha slowly raised her face and locked eyes with Kane. Her skin was streaked with oil and sweat, but her gaze was sharp and cold enough to make Kane pause. She set the wrench aside, wiped her hand briefly on her shirt, then spoke slowly, each word landing like a hammer. "Touch me again, and you'll regret it." The words echoed in the stillness of the mountains, freezing the air around them. Doyle raised his eyebrows, surprised that a woman would openly challenge them, especially one they thought could be easily pushed aside. Kane laughed again, but it sounded less certain now, as if he were trying to shake off the tension creeping in. Marcus tilted his head, his eyes drawn again to the ring. Inside, a battle stirred between his habit of disdain and a vague sense that he had overlooked something important. Aisha's warning felt outrageous to him, but the certainty in her voice made it hard to dismiss. Marcus Hale, a man who had closed billion-dollar deals, had never been put on edge like this, and the irony was, the one doing it was a woman covered in grease on a deserted mountain road. Kane stepped forward, his boots hitting the ground with weight. "Regret?" he repeated, voice thick with scorn. "You think you get to say things like that to us?" He reached for the wrench, but Aisha didn't move. Her stare was sharp as a blade, stopping him mid-reach. Doyle scoffed, cutting in. "Marcus, better be careful. Looks like she thinks she's special. Might want to check if that ring's real before she files a theft report." Marcus swallowed hard, saying nothing. He stood there with arms crossed, but his eyes showed a flicker of unease. The mocking words from the officers should have pleased him, yet somehow they made him uncomfortable. He didn't want to admit it, but from the moment he saw the ring, he knew he couldn't see Aisha as just another woman. Aisha took a deep breath, resting her grease-stained hand on the edge of the hood, her voice steady. "I warned you. Touch me again, and the whole town will know who you really are." Kane's brow tightened, his eyes flashing with irritation. Doyle gave him a quick pat on the shoulder, a signal to hold back, but he, too, felt the sting. Both men were used to bowed heads and easy compliance, and her warning landed like a slap across their pride. Marcus remained still, but his heart beat faster than usual. He was starting to realize this standoff wasn't just about a broken car. In the thick air, heavy with smoke and oil, he felt like he was standing between two worlds, one built on familiar power, uniforms, and social class, and the other, grounded in a quiet force he couldn't quite define. The glint from her ring felt like a sign that this was far more than a roadside argument. Wind whipped through the mountain pass, stirring dust and smoke, making the ring shine even brighter. Kane clenched his fists, but instead of acting, he lowered his voice, trying to regain control. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" Aisha gave a dry smile, joyless and sharp. "I know exactly who you are, and soon, you'll know who you're dealing with too." Doyle glanced sideways, a flicker of unease showing in his eyes. Marcus exhaled, his gaze resting longer on Aisha. For a brief moment, he felt like a bystander in a story pulling him in deeper than he wanted. Her words, though simple, had planted something undeniable. She wasn't someone who backed down. And that ring, the one he had dismissed, now pulled focus like a spotlight none of them could ignore. The mountain road sank into darkness, patrol lights flashing cold and hollow. None of them stepped back. Kane and Doyle stood rigid. Marcus watched in silence, and Aisha, with grease on her hands and light glinting from her ring, held her ground at the center, like a line drawn between truth long buried and justice about to rise. Doyle suddenly threw his hand out, knocking Aisha's hand off the hood. Grease flew from her fingers, splattering dark streaks onto her sweat-soaked shirt. The gesture wasn't just to stop her, it was a blunt denial, turning all her effort into a mockery in front of them. "Your filthy hands have no business touching a Bentley," Doyle snapped, each word dropping heavy into the thick smoke and tension. In his eyes, the silver car was the only thing worth protecting, and the woman in front of him was nothing more than an intruder to be cast out. Kane glanced over, a twisted grin curling on his face. He didn't miss the chance to pile on, dragging the words through his teeth. "Makes sense. Trash pickers like her wouldn't know a luxury car if it ran them over." The taunt hit sharply, carving into the already suffocating air. He wasn't speaking just to Aisha, he said it loud enough for Marcus, a reminder that they were all on one side, and Aisha was just the object of shared ridicule. Aisha didn't flinch from the blow. Her shoulders stayed square, eyes locked on Doyle. The grease stains on her shirt didn't faze her. What she saw was raw power, cloaked in a police uniform. She raised the hand that had been struck, gripped the wrench tightly again, and said, her voice dry and metallic, "I understand engines better than all of you combined." The conviction in her tone quieted even the mountain wind. It wasn't a loud rebellion, it was a direct strike at their arrogance. Marcus, who had stood with arms crossed the entire time, suddenly stepped forward. His face flushed, his voice cut through the night. "That's enough. I don't need your help anymore." Thankfully, these officers stepped in just in time. His words drew a new line. He had chosen his side, Kane and Doyle's, out of instinct to protect his pride. Marcus couldn't stand the fact that a woman he had looked down on could calmly hold her ground, perhaps even control the situation more than he did. He leaned on their authority to remind himself he still held the upper hand. Aisha glanced at Marcus. She wasn't surprised, but her eyes flashed cold. She had known he would stay silent, but now he had actively joined in, borrowing the officer's words to paint her as the problem. Doyle's shove, Kane's mockery, and now Marcus's rejection tightened around her like a ring of insult, closing in under the darkness. The air reeked of exhaust and contempt, pressing in like a weight. Doyle chuckled, pleased with Marcus's support, while Kane raised his brows in smug satisfaction. They believed she would back down, bow her head, or fall silent like so many before. But Aisha didn't yield. She said nothing to Marcus, nothing to Doyle or Kane. She stood tall, eyes locked on them, sharp as a blade. Marcus suddenly caught that look, and for a moment, he was unsettled. He couldn't explain why he felt like he was the one being interrogated by the very woman he had just dismissed. He was used to giving orders in boardrooms, used to applause at lavish parties. But here, standing on a quiet mountain road beneath Aisha's gaze, Marcus felt small and unsure. His own words echoed back at him, sounding bitter and cowardly. Doyle didn't stop. He jabbed a finger at Aisha's chest, his tone sharp and hostile. You need to remember, we decide who stands where, who gets to touch what. Don't pretend you know anything. Kane spat to the side, adding in a mocking drawl, people like you were born to stay on the outside. Don't try to force your way into places that don't belong to you. Aisha took a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes stayed fixed and steady. She knew their words weren't only meant for her. They echoed the mindset of an entire system used to pushing people like her to the margins. Rage welled up inside her, but she didn't let it take over. She held it back, pressed it into something solid, waiting for the right moment. Marcus tried to maintain his stance, but something inside was fracturing. He saw himself as the critic, yet now realized Aisha wasn't someone easily broken. Her defiant silence shook him more than any argument. He turned his face away, but his eyes drifted again to the silver ring on her hand. He kept telling himself it meant nothing, but the way it caught the light felt like proof he couldn't ignore. The whole stretch of road was lost in darkness, with only the strobing patrol lights cutting through. In that light, the scene was unmistakable. Doyle had just swatted away a woman's hand, Kane had mocked her, and Marcus had chosen their side. And in the center stood Aisha, grease on her hands, her shirt stained, the ring glowing like a contradiction none of them could yet understand. In that moment, the line between power and dignity collided head-on. The insults meant to bury her had instead ignited a tension more volatile than any of them expected. The mountain road was no longer just a place where a car had stalled. It had become a battleground, where every word, every glance, was pressing toward a breaking point from which there would be no return. Doyle leaned in closer, his face darkening, eyes sharp with threat. His right hand landed firmly on the handcuff pouch at his waist, the dry clink of metal against its clip cutting through the noise. His voice hissed, soaked in the authority he was used to using for control. One wrong move and I'll lock you up for attempted theft. The words echoed down the mountain road, merging with the wind and the engine smoke, making the air feel even tighter. Doyle didn't need proof. His word alone was enough to turn an innocent person into a criminal. Aisha tilted her head slightly, lips pressed tight before curling into a faint smile. It wasn't loud, but it cut deep, slicing through the ego of the men in uniform. You really want the whole town to see just how useless you are? She said. Her question landed light but lethal, striking directly at their pride. Doyle's face flushed, his grip on the cuffs tightened, and Kane's narrowed eyes lost their mocking grin. Neither of them had expected her to strike back so directly. They were used to fear, to quiet excuses, never to a black woman meeting their power with cold defiance. Marcus Hale stood beside them, arms crossed, eyes wide. He was tense, but still chose not to speak. Instead, he looked at Aisha's hand again, at the ring, catching the flicker of the patrol lights. Since earlier, he'd been trying to convince himself it was worthless, just a piece of cheap metal. But every flash of silver pulled at something in him, something he didn't want to admit, like the ring was guarding a truth he wasn't ready to face. While Kane and Doyle were still frozen from Aisha's words, a sudden sound came from behind them. A young man on a motorcycle had stopped, taken in the scene, and pulled out his phone. He quickly raised it, filming. The glow from his screen lit up the moment perfectly. The smoking silver Bentley, two white officers looming with force, Marcus standing by with folded arms, and Aisha, a black woman with grease on her hands facing them head-on. Every detail framed a raw image of injustice, ready for the world to see. Kane saw the movement and barked, "Put that phone down," but it was too late. The camera had already captured Doyle's hand on the cuffs, and the threat he had made. Kane's shout only made the man more determined. He held the phone steady, even stepped closer, eyes burning with challenge. In the lens, the ring on Aisha's hand flared brighter under the patrol lights, drawing every gaze. It became the center of the image, a kind of unspoken symbol, hitting Marcus, Kane, and Doyle with a message they couldn't ignore. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a reminder that true power didn't always wear a uniform. Doyle noticed the flash of the ring. His eyes wavered for a second, but he quickly masked it with a cold expression. He muttered, "Just a fake, don't think you can scare us." But his voice had lost its earlier force, now carrying a hint of unease. Kane caught the shift in his partner's gaze and grew more agitated. He wanted to stamp it out fast, to act, to prove who really held control. Aisha stood tall, fingers gently rotating the wrench, her eyes fixed on Doyle, then moving to Kane. Her silence had changed. It was no longer endurance, it was patience, a trap laid bare. She knew a phone was recording everything, knew the light from her ring couldn't be hidden, and knew every word and movement from these men was tying them tighter into their own net. Marcus cleared his throat, but still didn't speak. He could tell the situation had drifted far from what he had expected. He wanted only to be free of the stalled car, to return to his world of million-dollar deals, but now he found himself stuck in a moment where any action could put him on the wrong side. The ring flashed again. A sharp reminder that truth was no longer his to define it was slipping toward the woman he had underestimated. For a few seconds, the scene went still. Only the soft hum of the recording and the whistling mountain wind broke the silence. Doyle kept his hand on the cuffs. Kane held his threatening stance. Marcus remained with arms crossed, and Aisha alone in the center stood firm, the ring on her hand glowing like a small torch against the thick darkness. In that moment, the public threat no longer belonged to Aisha. It had turned into undeniable evidence, marking the start of a reversal no one had seen coming. The cooling fan of the Bentley still whirred faintly in the darkening air, but no one cared about the engine anymore. Every focus had shifted to Aisha's hand, where the silver ring flashed under the flickering patrol lights. Kane stepped forward, his boots crunching hard against the gravel, scattering small stones. He narrowed his eyes, his voice dropping low like steel grinding on stone. "That ring, where did you steal it from?" It wasn't a question, it was a strike, an open trap meant to cast Aisha as a criminal. Aisha paused, placing the wrench back into the toolbox with a dry clink. She turned, eyes locked on Kane without hesitation. Her face was slick with sweat, streaked with smudges of oil, but her gaze burned like fire buried beneath coals. Her voice came steady and cold. "That's beyond your understanding." Each word landed sharp, unhurried, unshaken, like a sentence passed. Kane froze for half a second. Marcus stood slightly behind, arms still folded, but his body tilted forward. The arrogance that usually lined his gaze had faded. Now, his eyes stayed fixed on the ring on Aisha's hand. He couldn't look away from the light, reflecting off the small stone set in the band. A light he recognized, one only known to someone who had collected fine jewelry. He swallowed hard. A thread of suspicion sparked in his mind, followed by growing curiosity. If the ring was real, it carried not only financial value, but also the weight of power from a class even he was cautious around. Doyle stepped closer, lips curling into a smile that was half mockery, half intrigue. He glanced at Marcus, then back at Aisha, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Hand it over. If it's real, maybe I'll let you go." His words dropped into the air like a taunt, turning the truth into a gamble. His movements were slow but deliberate, one hand already resting on his belt, ready to grab at a moment's notice. Aisha held her gaze steady, neither flinching nor looking nervous. She inhaled deeply, her fingers unconsciously twisting the ring, sending another flash of silver into the air. The light hit Doyle's and Kane's faces, exposing the tension beneath their bluster. She knew they were waiting for fear, waiting for her to hide her hand, to back away, to deny something. But Aisha did none of that. Marcus shifted his gaze between the people around him, feeling the moment slipping out of control. Inside, two conflicting instincts pulled at him. One urged him to step forward and stop the madness. The other whispered to stay quiet and observe because that ring might reveal something he needed to know. Curiosity, the weakness of the wealthy, had taken hold, and now, Marcus was trapped in it. Kane tapped his boot lightly on the ground, impatient. "You think you're too good to answer?" he said, narrowing his eyes, trying to corner Aisha. Doyle let out a harsh laugh and followed up. "If it's not stolen, prove it. Or, are you just scared we'll find out the truth?" The taunts came like lashes in the air, aimed to shatter Aisha's composure. But Aisha didn't give in. Her voice came low and firm. "This has more value than all of you combined, but not in the way you think. If you want to touch it, be ready to pay the price." Her reply made Kane chuckle dryly, but it lacked the confidence he'd had before. Doyle faltered for a split second, then masked it with his usual aggressive scowl. The young man still stood a few meters away, phone held high, camera slowly capturing every expression. The wind made the frame shake slightly, but the image was clear. Aisha's hand with the radiant ring, Kane's strained face, Doyle on edge, Marcus watching anxiously. Every detail struck the eye of the one filming, and he knew this wasn't just an argument, it was proof of something bigger, a truth the whole town would soon be talking about. Marcus exhaled, but his gaze remained locked on the ring. He thought of cocktail parties, watching wealthy men flaunt flawless diamonds. But this light was different, older, deeper, carrying the weight of something not everyone had the right to own. His fingertips trembled slightly. He was beginning to see a truth he couldn't control. Kane, unable to bear the challenge, reached out as if to grab it, but Aisha turned fully, pulling her hand behind her, her eyes as calm as ever. She didn't yell, didn't flinch. She spoke slowly, voice quiet but cutting. You made a mistake thinking I'd be easy to break. Doyle froze. Kane's hand stopped mid-air. Silence fell again, heavier this time, because they all knew the game had shifted. Marcus licked his lips, trying to hide his tension. He knew those men wouldn't back off easily, but he also saw that Aisha wasn't someone they could command. To him, this was no longer about fixing a car. It had become a reckoning of power, dignity, and the truth buried in the ring's glow. The phone kept recording. The patrol lights kept flashing. Smoke still rose from the engine, and in the middle of it all, the tension reached its peak, and each person pulled into a spiral with no way out. Aisha stood firm, her hand clenched around the ring, the silver light reflecting in their eyes, like a reminder that truth has its own power, and anyone who dares to touch it will have to pay. In a moment that felt frozen in time, Aisha closed her hand, her grease-streaked fingers tightening into a fist. The silver ring blazed, throwing sharp light onto Kane's and Doyle's faces, making both men blink. She lifted her chin, her voice cutting through the air firm, unwavering, leaving no room for reply. Touch it, and you'll lose your badge before you make it back to the station. It didn't sound like a reckless threat. It sounded like a verdict, already written, waiting to be executed. Every other sound vanished. Only her words lingered, hanging in the smoke and the stench of gasoline. Marcus Hale froze. His eyes widened, his chest clenched as if something unseen had wrapped around his ribs. He had never heard anyone speak to the police like that, let alone a woman he had dismissed minutes earlier. The clarity in her voice sent a chill down his spine. Marcus had walked through cutthroat deals, had watched men destroy each other in boardrooms, but none of it rattled him like this. Her words weren't just for Kane and Doyle. They shattered the wall of superiority he had spent years building. Kane staggered slightly, his smirk gone, replaced by a stiff, unreadable face. Doyle stopped moving, his hand dropping from the cuffs, his eyes darting as if suddenly aware of being watched. And they were. From behind, the young man with the phone shouted, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Oh my God, did you see that ring?" The cry pierced the silence, snapping everyone back to the moment. The lens shook in the man's trembling hand, but it still captured the ring's gleam, the officer's stunned expressions, and Marcus's eerie quiet. Aisha didn't blink. Her gaze stayed locked, knowing this was no longer just a confrontation. It had been documented, turned into undeniable evidence. Doyle clenched his jaw, ready to bark back, but his eyes passed the camera, and his voice caught in his throat. Kane turned, patrol lights casting across his face, revealing a flicker of panic before he quickly masked it. Marcus took a small step back, chaos swirling inside him. He knew if this footage spread, it wouldn't just be about the officer's shame. He would be part of it too, a complicit figure who had stood silently while a woman was mocked and threatened. His eyes returned to the ring, searching for an answer, but all it gave was its cold, unflinching light. The young man adjusted his phone with shaky hands, his breath audible in the recording. What he was capturing wasn't a roadside argument. It was the raw moment when power was flipped upside down. A woman once dismissed, insulted, now stood her ground, and stared straight at a badge, and with one sentence and a flash of silver, made an entire system hesitate. He knew this video wouldn't stop at a few views. It would spread. It would ignite something. Aisha kept her hand steady, the ring's shine carving itself into every stare. No one dared move forward. Doyle clenched his fist, but couldn't act. Kane inhaled sharply, wanting to speak, but his throat locked up, and the words that slipped out sounded like a clumsy excuse. Their silence was the loudest response to Aisha's warning. Marcus swallowed hard, feeling blood rush to his face. For the first time in his life, he stood in a moment where money and reputation meant nothing. He was forced to watch, forced to listen, and now the ring's light held him in place. He wanted to escape, to leave it all behind, but he didn't dare move. He knew that one wrong gesture would pull him under, into the storm already forming. The air had reached its peak. Every breath felt explosive, every twitch a potential spark. Then, from the darkness, the wind picked up dust and dry leaves, lifting Aisha's words and carrying them farther, bouncing off the cliffs. In that moment, everyone understood a line had been crossed. The threat no longer came from the police, it came from the woman they had tried to crush, and that line would never be undone. That night, while the city glowed under streetlights and the rush of sirens, the video appeared online. Within hours of being posted, the caption beneath it sparked thousands of shares. Cops laughed, then froze at the ring. The sentence was simple, but it carried the full weight of contrast and reversal. Viewers didn't just witness a roadside conflict, they saw the roots of injustice, how easily dignity was trampled, and how truth could erupt from the smallest detail. Thousands of comments followed, ranging from outrage to curiosity to admiration. People debated the ring, the mysterious woman's background, Marcus's guilty silence, and the rare unraveling of two armed officers. A story from a quiet mountain road suddenly became a focal point for an entire community, setting off waves no one could stop. Back on that same mountain road, Aisha stood in silence, her hand clenched, her eyes unwavering. She knew everything had changed. Kane and Doyle no longer held power. Marcus was no longer the confident millionaire. It was she, the woman with oil-stained hands, who had rewritten the rules. Rules they hadn't prepared for, but now had no choice but to face. And those rules would follow them, haunt them, to the very end. Within hours of appearing online, the video clip from the desolate mountain road had flooded every major platform, spreading so fast that even national news outlets scrambled to headline it. Every frame was eerily sharp. The flash of silver on Aisha's hand, the frozen expressions of Kane and Doyle, Marcus's unnatural silence, combined with her firm warning. The clip painted a complete picture of power reversed. Viewers repeatedly paused at the moment her hand clenched, rewinding again and again to make sure they hadn't imagined it. The comment section exploded, thousands of voices asking the same question, all drawn to the one detail no one could look away from: who is she, really? The question repeated like a chorus, spawning endless theories. Some guessed she was a brilliant engineer overlooked by the system, others thought she was the wife or daughter of a powerful businessman, and a few even speculated the ring held historical value. The online community, always eager to dissect a mystery, now wandered deep into a maze built on a single gleam from her hand. On Twitter, two hashtags rose to the top of the national trends: number, Justice Ring, and number, Wrong Target. The first captured the public's outrage at watching police officers get confronted and fail to respond. The second became a symbol of a classic mistake targeting the wrong person for humiliation. So many users joined in that anyone opening their phone would see it instantly, from office workers to college students, from activists to casual followers of celebrity gossip. Clip segments of the video circulated widely, each person focusing on one detail. Some zoomed in on Doyle's eyes when he saw the ring. Others circled Marcus's isolated face, and many added subtitles to Aisha's razor-sharp line and pushed it to millions of likes. Meme images poured out not to mock her, but to ridicule the panic of those who once held authority. Meanwhile, the image of Aisha's hand with the glowing ring became an icon, replicated across social profiles, printed on posters, and shared across neighborhoods. Media outlets joined in. Not just local papers, but major magazines from distant cities featured the clip with curious, provocative headlines. The articles didn't just summarize, they questioned, can justice rise from a single moment? That question fueled debate, from the power of visual evidence to the danger of unchecked authority. Public attention shifted beyond the officer's actions. Now, everyone wanted to know more about the woman who had left three powerful men in absolute silence. In private groups, amateur investigations began. People zoomed in on each frame, trying to read the engraved markings on the ring, comparing them to images from rare jewelry collections. Some claimed they had seen the ring at a prestigious auction years ago. Others said it was tied to a renowned financial conglomerate, though no solid proof emerged. The growing speculation only deepened the mystery and amplified its allure. For Aisha, everything escalated too fast. From a silent moment on a mountain road, she had become the focus of an entire online community. Every post, hashtag, and edited photo helped shape her image not as a solitary woman, but as a symbol of resistance and dignity. And while many were still obsessed over theories about the ring, a stronger movement was taking shape, a unified call for justice. Beneath the layers of outrage and curiosity, countless comments emerged from people saying they wanted to know what would happen next. They wanted to see a resolution, to watch those who mocked her be held accountable. That heat spread beyond social media, beginning to turn into real pressure on a system long accustomed to hiding its flaws. From there, a storm had begun, one that could no longer be stopped. As the clips continued to spread, more people started paying closer attention to the ring on Aisha's hand. At first, it had been just a small detail under the dim forest light. But the more it was enlarged and replayed, the clearer it became. The engravings weren't random. The intricate lines curved into a distinct emblem, reminiscent of a symbol once seen in luxury collections owned by the elite. One account even placed a screenshot of the ring beside an old photo from an auction in New York, showing an almost perfect match. Comments beneath the comparison exploded. People began to mention the name Rowe, a family famous in financial circles, known for controlling major corporations and vast wealth. The rumor spread like wildfire, from a few mentions to tens of thousands of repeated posts. That's the Rowe family ring, from an old financial dynasty. The claim was no longer a private guess. It was quickly becoming a widely accepted truth across the internet. The connection between Aisha and the name Rowe stunned many. Anyone familiar with financial news knew the Rowes were not only wealthy but politically influential. If the ring on Aisha's hand was truly a relic of that lineage, it meant she was far from a nameless woman on a roadside. She was a key figure in a much larger story. As the discussion grew, the original question, who is she, gained a clearer answer. Aisha Rowe wasn't just a skilled mechanic. She belonged to a legacy powerful enough to make even the most influential pause. On financial forums, many self-proclaimed experts joined the analysis. They pulled images from old reports, blurry shots from shareholder meetings, and excerpts from current affairs magazines years ago. All signs pointed to one conclusion: the ring symbolized inheritance, crafted exclusively for someone of direct bloodline. This not only clarified the ring's value but also elevated the story to a new level of drama. Police had mocked, even attempted to humiliate, someone who might hold a position they had never dreamed of reaching. Marcus also appeared in several short interview clips taken from past meetings, now paired with sarcastic comments from online users. People labeled him as someone who stood on the wrong side, having chosen silence instead of defending Aisha. His image, arms crossed as he watched in the video, circulated with the caption, "Millionaire, outplayed by a ring." The contrast fueled public outrage, as viewers clearly saw how he had aligned himself with those abusing power. International media did not miss the moment either. Some commentators stated this was not just a minor incident, but a mirror reflecting how society treats those outside the privileged class. Articles emphasized that the ring's emergence was the trigger that exploded the debate, revealing how discrimination is not only unjust, but can ultimately backfire on those who enforce it. In live online discussions, people debated more than just the ring. They speculated on Aisha's possible role in inheriting the corporation. Theories circulated rapidly. Some believed she had walked away from the spotlight to live a humble life. Others thought she was waiting for the right moment to return, and the ring was the sign of that comeback. Regardless of which version was true, public opinion agreed on one point: what happened on that mountain road could not be buried. The more evidence and theories were shared, the more the truth became an alluring mystery. Aisha didn't need to speak. The ring told her story for her. And what began as a video capturing an act of abuse had transformed into the focal point of a global conversation, where outrage, curiosity, and anticipation all collided as people waited to see what would be revealed next. The next morning, local newspapers simultaneously published shocking headlines. Aisha Rowe was confirmed to be the fiancée of the late chairman of the Rowe Financial Group, one of the most influential families in banking and investment. The article didn't just feature a close-up of the ring seen in the viral clip, but also included a photo from the engagement announcement years earlier, where Aisha stood next to the now-deceased chairman. The news ended all speculation, turning vague rumors into a clear truth. The woman once dismissed on the mountain road was not a nobody, but a figure with enough weight to shift an entire community's perspective. Marcus Hale read the headline on the large screen at the digital news office, his hand trembling as he scrolled down. Every word struck his mind like a hammer, replaying each moment he had stood by with folded arms, allowing the contempt to spill from the mouths of those he had considered temporary allies. In his head, the image of Aisha lifting her chin, eyes unwavering, hand gripping the ring, became unmistakably vivid. He sat stunned, almost frozen, realizing that everything he had said and done had placed him firmly on the wrong side. On social media, the information spread like wildfire. Credible outlets confirmed it, while journalists dug deeper into the relationship between Aisha and the Rowe family. Photos from public events resurfaced, showing Aisha alongside the late chairman at high-level meetings. Images that had long been forgotten by the public eye now served as undeniable proof that she was not just a woman who happened to be on that mountain road. The more Marcus read, the more uneasy he felt. He didn't want to believe it, but the facts were laid out in front of him, complete with photos and confirmations from industry insiders. He remembered his smug remarks, his mocking tone, and the way he let the officers spew insults unchecked. Now, it all came back like stains that couldn't be washed away. Inside his office, the silence felt heavy, and in that stillness, Marcus realized his pride had led him into an irreversible mistake. The report further clarified that the ring on Aisha's hand was custom-made, bearing a symbol representing the Rowe family's inheritance rights. It was not just a personal keepsake, but legal proof protecting both the family's assets and legacy. This revelation fueled even more public outrage, as people recalled how the officers had dismissed it as a flea market fake. Hundreds of comments poured in, denouncing the arrogant blindness, calling it a prime example of how prejudice can turn those in power into laughingstocks. Major news networks joined in, launching long-form segments, inviting analysts to weigh in. They spoke not only of Aisha as an heir, but as a symbol of resilience against oppression. One journalist noted that Aisha's years of silence, followed by her sudden appearance in that exact situation, was what gave the story its gripping intensity and weight. Marcus now became the center of public backlash. The image of him standing next to Kane and Doyle, his indifferent gaze, was shared thousands of times with captions dripping in sarcasm. The wrong side. The silence he had chosen to preserve his dignity now turned into a fatal wound, transforming him from a powerful millionaire into a coward in the eyes of the public. He realized that Aisha didn't need to say another word. The truth had spoken for her. Elsewhere in the city, Aisha continued her daily routines, avoiding media appearances and posting nothing online. Her silence only deepened the public's curiosity, elevating her symbolic presence even more. Rumors, old clippings, and interviews from friends and colleagues of the late chairman were all unearthed to add more layers to the portrait of a woman who was both humble and carried a distinct weight within her. The storm of information didn't slow down. From a short clip on a mountain road, the leaked truth had opened a much larger door, lifting Aisha from the role of someone dismissed to the central figure in a powerful social narrative. And while the public continued dissecting every detail, Marcus sat in silence, eyes hollow, because he knew that the mockery he delivered that day would forever mark the moment he misjudged a person so completely that the entire world now bore witness. As news of Aisha's identity spread across headlines, Kane and Doyle's reactions came swiftly and awkwardly. Their personal accounts, once filled with images in police uniforms, bragging posts about past achievements, and smug commentary, suddenly vanished that very afternoon. Social media users noticed they had wiped everything, leaving blank pages behind. As if overnight, they realized every trace could become evidence against them. Their silence didn't calm the outrage. Instead, it stirred even more questions. The public didn't see it as remorse, but rather as a clear sign of cowardice, proof that those who once strutted down the mountain road now hid in the shadows to avoid the public gaze. The media quickly seized this, publishing analyses that erasing online traces cannot erase collective memory. The clip was still there, shared millions of times, backed up by thousands of users, with every word and gesture now a documented record. The more Kane and Doyle tried to hide, the more intense the public's curiosity became. People began tracing back previous complaints against them, digging up small mentions in local columns to piece together a long, stained history. Their silence now resembled the shadow that comes before a storm, not to be forgotten, but to signal that a far more thorough investigation was on the way. Meanwhile, Aisha continued to remain calm, never appearing in the media, never posting anything on social media. But when reporters swarmed the small house where she was staying, she finally agreed to speak. In front of dozens of microphones and cameras zoomed in close, Aisha spoke slowly, her gaze unwavering, each word clear, as if meant to etch itself into everyone's memory. "I don't need to prove my identity. Their actions proved enough." The sentence was brief, but it cut through all debate like a blade. It instantly became the featured quote on most headlines, printed in bold, and shared widely as a powerful message about dignity and truth. Public reaction to that response grew even more intense. People paired the quote with the original clip, turning it into a dual image and message. On one side was the moment the ring glinted in the dark. On the other was her calm but resolute statement. Together, they portrayed Aisha no longer as a mysterious figure, but as a symbol of resolve and justice. Praise flooded the comment sections, calling her the woman of truth, the one who made the system bow, and the voice of the overlooked. Marcus Hale, hearing those words on television, sat in silence for hours. He knew the sentence was meant for him too, for his silence and quiet complicity that day, on the mountain road. The composure in Aisha's voice made him feel smaller than ever. If for Kane and Doyle it was an accusation, then for Marcus, it was a mirror reflecting the cowardice he could no longer deny. With a single statement, Aisha had shifted the entire conversation. No one questioned her anymore. No one asked for further proof, because the abuse of power, the mockery, and the threats had already exposed the truth. And it was her calm that turned everything meant to be buried into a firestorm, burning away the arrogant masks of those who once thought themselves untouchable. The spread of the story didn't stop at public outcry. When social pressure reached its peak, the police department's internal affairs division was forced to act. A brief statement was issued confirming that Kane and Doyle had been urgently summoned for investigation, marking the shift from online uproar to an official legal process. Images of the two officers entering the internal affairs building in silence, avoiding cameras, immediately appeared on the front pages of several newspapers. All eyes were on them not to hear excuses, but to watch how fast the collapse would come. At the morning press conference, the Internal Affairs representative confirmed that all conduct would be reviewed from the beginning, including abuse of power and past violations. That statement pushed public sentiment even higher, as many had long suspected that Kane and Doyle had crossed the line more than once. Reporters quickly began digging through old records and forgotten news briefs, uncovering a long list of incidents connected to the two officers. Archived news reports revealed that over the years, both Kane and Doyle had repeatedly been accused of targeting the local black community. There were cases of unjustified searches, detentions without cause, and even victims with injuries that were quickly filed away as lacking sufficient evidence. The short clips that once went unnoticed now served as additional proof that what happened with Aisha wasn't an exception, but the visible tip of a much larger problem. The press seized the opportunity to launch a wave of investigative features. Major online platforms published long-form articles painting a broader picture of systemic abuse and internal cover-ups. City residents, already long frustrated, now had even more reason to speak up. Online discussions erupted everywhere, with many sharing personal or secondhand stories of discrimination and bias. Community forums overflowed with similar accounts, turning Aisha's case into a rallying point for a wider movement. During televised panels, many legal experts were invited to weigh in. They argued that the summoning of Kane and Doyle wasn't just about individual accountability, but a warning to the entire system that abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. Some stated plainly that without the video, the incident would have quietly disappeared like so many before. It was the flash of the ring, combined with Aisha's unwavering stance, that created enough pressure to force authorities into action. As past incidents came to light, the image of Kane and Doyle darkened. Photos they once proudly posted in uniform were now paired with accusations by online users, turned into viral caricatures. The silence they tried to maintain was no longer a shield, but a silent admission to the public. Under mounting pressure, Internal Affairs announced they would release the investigation results publicly to ensure transparency, a promise the public demanded be fully upheld. While that was happening, Aisha remained silent. She didn't appear in any interviews or issue new statements. But her silence was no longer seen as avoidance. It carried the weight of someone who had forced an entire system to act. From one moment on a mountain road, the story had gone far beyond, exposing the shadows that many had deliberately ignored for years. Kane and Doyle entered the investigation under close watch, and society followed every step, because everyone knew this time there would be no easy way out. When the list of witnesses was released, the name Marcus Hale stirred public uproar. A millionaire once praised in financial circles now had to sit across from investigators to recount the moment he had witnessed, and that struck a heavy blow to the polished image he had carefully maintained. That morning, as he stepped out of his car and walked into Internal Affairs, Marcus looked drained, his eyes dazed, his silver hair unkempt from a sleepless night. He tried to hide his unease behind dark sunglasses, but reporters still captured every moment he lowered his head, dodging questions. The photos flooded news sites, captioned with biting lines, "The man who stood by and watched is now an unwilling witness." Inside the interrogation room, Marcus sat upright, but his shoulders were visibly tense. Questions came in rapid succession, giving him no time to think. Investigators wanted to know why he didn't intervene when police mocked and threatened Aisha, why he joined in the ridicule instead of standing up for someone clearly innocent. Marcus stammered a few times, his voice lacking the confidence he once had. He claimed he didn't want to escalate the situation, that everything happened too fast. But every excuse only made him lose more credibility. The investigators took careful notes, showing no emotion, but the atmosphere was enough to make Marcus realize that his silence that day had left a stain no explanation could erase. Outside, news stations broadcast live footage of Marcus leaving the session. He walked quickly, eyes downcast, his face showing obvious fatigue. People gathered nearby booed, some holding signs that read clearly, "Standing with injustice is still a crime." Those shouts made his steps feel heavier. Marcus knew the reputation he had built through successful deals was now overshadowed by a single moment of mistaken silence. Meanwhile, Aisha remained composed. Through all the noise, she never tried to defend herself or engage in the ongoing debate. She appeared at a few summons, but only sat quietly, observing everything, offering no more than the necessary brief responses for protocol. Her eyes were calm, without resentment or shouting, as if she already knew where the outcome would come from and how. And that very silence made others feel a strength greater than any defense she could have spoken. Many reporters described that when Aisha stepped out of the investigation room, she didn't avoid the cameras, nor did she try to capitalize on the attention. She simply walked past quietly, the ring still on her finger, the same one that had shaken public opinion. People standing outside watched her go, and it was they who carried the message forward. She doesn't need to speak, the truth has already revealed itself. From the public's perspective, Aisha had nothing to explain, because every piece of evidence, every action by those who faced her, had spoken on her behalf. In contrast, Marcus looked even more pitiful. He spoke often, but his words were tangled and unconvincing. Meanwhile, Aisha, once seen as lesser, only had to stay silent for people to believe in the strength of justice. The story continued to spread, not just about the misconduct of the police, but as a mirror reflecting how each person's response to injustice determines how they will be remembered. Marcus faltered, while Aisha stood tall, and that contrast became the clearest proof of what the public needed to see. On the day of the hearing, the City Hall courtroom was packed. From journalists to everyday citizens, everyone came, wanting to witness the outcome of the two officers who had sparked national outrage. Kane and Doyle sat in the front row, faces like stone, but their eyes avoided contact. When called to speak, both repeated a familiar refrain, insisting they were just doing their job, that what happened on the mountain road was due to reasonable suspicion, and that they never intended to offend. Their words came out smoothly, as if rehearsed, but no one in the room was convinced. Murmurs rose, discomfort written clearly on every face watching them. Council representatives asked pointed questions, pressing them to explain why they used demeaning language, why they attempted to touch Aisha, and why they threatened her with handcuffs. Doyle offered weak excuses, claiming the situation that day was tense, and they only wanted to ensure the car's safety, but the moment he finished, the prosecutor immediately requested the original video be played. The large screen lit up, each detail unmistakably clear. Doyle shining a flashlight in Aisha's face, Kane smirking, Marcus standing with crossed arms, and the flash of the silver ring, as Aisha's firm warning rang out. The room fell silent, and only the recording played. Mocking laughter, threats, barking commands, and the two officers' nonchalance echoed through the chamber. When the clip reached the part where the young man cried out in alarm, the entire hall stirred at once. Their earlier justifications crumbled. The truth was now undeniable. Kane lowered his head, while Doyle shifted in his seat, sweat beading at his temples. Photographers clicked non-stop, flashes turning the space into a public stage where the two officers had nowhere to hide. Some in the crowd let out bitter laughter, comparing their recent statements to what the video revealed. Just doing our job had become a joke, a living testimony of how easily the truth dismantles lies in the face of justice. When the clip ended, the council had a few questions left. The prosecutor spoke a single sentence. The video has answered for every excuse. The sound rang out, clear and final. Everything Kane and Doyle had prepared collapsed. In the audience, applause broke out, not celebratory, but a release of long-held frustration. Aisha sat in the back row, quietly observing. She didn't stand, didn't speak, but her gaze was steady and calm. To her, the truth had spoken for itself. No further explanation was needed. In that moment, her presence grew stronger, a symbol of silence, carrying immense weight. The hearing closed with a clear conclusion. Lies cannot survive once the truth has been recorded. Kane and Doyle left the room with heavy steps and dark expressions. In contrast, the public exited with a lighter spirit, knowing that a measure of justice had begun to be served. From that moment on, all eyes turned forward, awaiting the next steps in the legal process, where justice was no longer just a slogan, but something finally placed on the scales. Right after the hearing ended, the atmosphere outside the police headquarters grew more intense by the minute. Hundreds of citizens had gathered since morning, carrying signs, drums, and loudspeakers. They held up boards with clear messages: "Justice for Aisha. End abuse of power. We will not stay silent." The chants echoed through the streets, bounced off the walls of the building that once symbolized authority, but now stood as the most strongly questioned institution. The atmosphere was charged with both anger and resolve, like a massive wave rising from the depths of society, no longer containable. Journalists jostled to capture the scene, cameras sweeping across every tense face, every bead of sweat running down the cheeks of those holding signs. The drums beat steadily, blending with the chants to form a relentless rhythm, like the music of a never-ending protest. Each time someone spoke through a loudspeaker, the crowd answered in unison, turning the square in front of the building into a massive forum, where the people's voices rose above traffic horns and the city's hum. When the building's large doors swung open, every gaze shifted. Amid the blinding lights from dozens of cameras and phones, Aisha stepped out, her pace slow but steady. The camera flashes caught the silver ring on her hand, casting a light stronger than any slogan. For a moment, the crowd fell silent, drawn into that single instant. No words were needed, just the glint of the ring in the spotlight was enough to make her the undeniable symbol at the center of it all. The crowd began to cheer, but it wasn't chaotic noise. They chanted her name, voice after voice. "Aisha, Aisha," the sound echoed, blending with the strobe of camera flashes. Those too far to see her face still caught the flash of the ring, and that alone was enough to ignite emotion. Young people live-streamed the moment, broadcasting it to the world. Within minutes, hundreds of thousands of views poured in, along with a flood of comments, praising her bravery, honoring the silence more powerful than 1,000 speeches. Aisha stood on the steps, not raising a hand, not giving a speech. She simply looked out at the crowd, her gaze calm yet powerful. The ring caught the flash once more, like a beacon shining through. Across from her stood a line of police officers, but even they lowered their heads, none dared speak. In that moment, the line between the powerful and the powerless seemed to reverse, and everyone knew that change had begun. On social media, the image of Aisha stepping out before the crowd spread instantly. The photo captured the exact moment the ring reflected the light, becoming an iconic image captioned, "When the truth shines on its own." It was shared at lightning speed, accompanied by emotional comments. Many wrote that they cried upon seeing it, not out of sorrow, but because it reminded them that faith in justice still exists. Marcus, standing hidden among reporters in a corner, watched the scene with tangled emotions. He recalled the moment he chose silence, remembered the cruel words he had spoken, and now saw all of it consumed by the image of a woman standing tall in the light and before the crowd. He suddenly realized that the wealth, pride, and power he once held no longer gave him any standing in that moment. All eyes were on Aisha, while he saw himself as small and out of place. The crowd continued chanting, but this time it was a new slogan: justice for all. The words weren't just for Aisha, but for anyone ever trampled by power, for stories never recorded, for pain long buried. Today's hearing may have been just the beginning, but Aisha stepping out with that glowing ring made people believe justice was no longer an abstract idea. It was real, right in front of them, under the bright light of flashing cameras, and echoed by the voices of thousands. Aisha said nothing as she stepped off the platform, but the weight of that silence made the crowd erupt even louder. Hands were raised high, signs were thrown into the air, and chants rolled on without end. In the city's history, few moments had ever been marked this powerfully. A woman walked out, ring shining on her hand, facing an entire system, and made it listen. The next day, during the public session at City Hall, the attorney representing the Rowe family appeared before dozens of reporters and waiting citizens. He carried a thick folder, his voice clear, each word ringing out distinctly. The ring seen in the footage is not an ordinary piece of jewelry. It is the legal heirloom of the late Chairman Rowe, custom-made and recorded in the inheritance documents as a symbol of power transfer. Those words brought the entire room to silence. There was no room left for speculation or interpretation. The truth had been confirmed with legal evidence, affirming that the light from the ring carried the weight of an entire legacy. The crowd in the hall stirred all at once. Many stood and applauded, not for the material value of the jewelry, but because they felt justice taking shape. Reporters immediately noted every detail, and major newspapers soon published headlines that read, "The Justice Ring, Undeniable Evidence." In the eyes of the public, the ring was no longer just a symbol of prestige, but a torch shining light on those who had long been trampled. In a corner of the room, Marcus Hale sat frozen, his hand clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. As the lawyer's voice echoed through the hall, all he could do was lower his head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. In his mind, the words of scorn he had once spoken came flooding back as vividly as if they'd just happened. He remembered the moment he smirked, the biting remarks he used to elevate himself, and the way he folded his arms, and stayed silent instead of stepping in. Each memory cut into his pride like a blade, leaving him breathless. Marcus knew that even if he tried to explain that he had been caught off guard or didn't recognize the truth, the public wouldn't accept it. In their eyes, he had chosen to side with injustice, and that choice now stood exposed as a wrongdoing. He kept his head down, beads of sweat falling onto the paper in front of him, blending with the shame that couldn't be washed away. Meanwhile, Aisha sat quietly in the upper row, her eyes fixed on the podium. She said nothing, showed no signs of triumph. That calmness only made her presence more powerful. People looked at her and saw determination, saw someone who needed no defense because the truth had spoken for her. The silver ring still glinted on her hand, its shine reflecting not only under the courtroom lights but in every eye watching, reminding them that justice sometimes comes through resilience and silence. The attorney continued detailing the legal validity of the heirloom, citing clauses from the will to prove that Aisha was entrusted with defending the family's honor. He declared that any act of disrespect toward her was, by extension, an insult to the entire Rowe lineage. His words left Kane and Doyle, seated on the defendant's bench, unable to raise their heads. Their faces tightened, hands trembling slightly, as the mockery they had once voiced became evidence against them. Applause broke out again as the announcement concluded. Outside, the crowd gathered in front of City Hall cheered, many raising signs bearing the image of the ring, treating it as the emblem of a collective victory. No one had doubts anymore, and no one could forget the truth that every mocking word once spoken had now been buried by the very shimmer of justice. Marcus remained seated, head bowed. In that silent moment, the image of Aisha no longer appeared in his mind as the woman beneath the sunset fixing a car, but as the symbol that made him realize he had failed to choose the right side. And that failure, he understood, would follow him like a long shadow that would never leave. Immediately after the announcement, analytical articles and commentary flooded the media. A seasoned journalist published a headline that struck like a thunderclap: "Not just a ring, but justice gleaming." His article didn't dwell on the material value or symbolism of the jewelry, but emphasized that what made the ring powerful was the context in which it appeared the moment a humiliated woman stood up to challenge an entire system, and the ring's glow became proof of truth. The sharp words spread rapidly, shared by millions as a new slogan, concise, yet cutting to the heart of the matter. From those articles, public sentiment surged again. People no longer wanted just an apology or a report, they demanded concrete action. Discussions broke out on television, in cafes, even at small neighborhood markets, all circling one demand: those who abused power must be dismissed immediately. Online polls were launched, and over 90% of respondents agreed that Kane and Doyle were unfit to remain in law enforcement. That pressure grew by the hour, forcing senior officials into emergency meetings to find a resolution. It didn't stop there. Numerous social organizations and human rights groups quickly launched advocacy campaigns. They handed out flyers, hung posters featuring the gleaming ring alongside the words, "Justice cannot be buried." Peaceful marches were organized, with citizens carrying signs calling for dismissals, chanting slogans, and live streaming the events, flooding every platform with their message. Once again, the light from the ring extended far beyond Aisha's personal story. It had become a collective symbol, bound to a shared desire for change. Inside the police department's internal meeting hall, tension was razor-sharp. Senior leaders were fully aware that any hesitation would risk the entire system being swept away by the wave of public outrage. The anger was no longer tied to a single incident, but had grown into a reckoning with a culture of abuse years in the making. Every chant in the streets, every front-page headline sounded like a countdown, making any delay a potential death blow to their credibility. Marcus Hale followed the developments in silence, his face darkened. He knew well that the mocking words he once uttered had not only hurt Aisha but also turned him into a symbol of indifference. Reading the phrase, "justice" gleaming in the headlines, felt like a verdict handed down to him, reminding him that nothing he had said could be erased, and that society's outrage spared no one who had stood on the wrong side. Meanwhile, Aisha maintained her usual composure. She didn't appear on television, nor did she comment on the growing wave of demands. But the image of her standing at the hearing, the ring gleaming on her hand, was enough to move the public to act on her behalf. No one needed her to say anything more, because the message was already crystal clear. Justice must be served, and dismissal was the first step that could no longer be delayed. The pressure intensified, turning into an unstoppable wave. Each day that passed without action against Kane and Doyle only spread the anger further. International media began to report on the case, adding to the discomfort of local officials. Under the watchful eyes of the entire community, they knew that dismissals were no longer about appeasing public opinion. They were the bare minimum to preserve a fragile sense of trust. Amid the chants echoing through protest marches, that journalist's words reappeared everywhere. Not just a ring, but justice gleaming. It became the collective voice, asserting that true power didn't lie in the beauty of the object, but in the unwavering stance of the one who wore it. And from that strength, the public demanded immediate change, viewing dismissal as the necessary first move to correct mistakes that had been left unchecked for far too long. When public pressure reached its peak, the Internal Affairs Division was forced to release files it had long kept hidden. Thick stacks of documents were opened, detailing a series of violations involving Kane and Doyle. Reports from years back showed the two officers had been flagged for stopping cars without cause, detaining innocent people beyond legal time limits, and even using force in situations where civilians offered no resistance. These records had once been tucked away in drawers under the excuse of insufficient evidence, but now, with the Aisha footage exposed, everything was re-examined under the light of justice, leaving no room for cover-ups. News of the violations spread quickly, becoming a second public outrage. People were furious, not just over how Kane and Doyle treated Aisha, but because they realized it was part of a recurring, systemic pattern that had gone unchecked for years. Journalists dug into every detail, listing specific cases, raiding a small immigrant-owned store, verbally abusing a black student on the street. These weren't just numbers on paper anymore, they were puzzle pieces in a dark portrait of abuse and prejudice. As the press expanded their investigations, many former victims who had remained silent out of fear decided to come forward. They appeared in interviews, recounting in detail what they had endured at the hands of Kane and Doyle. A middle-aged man described being pulled over late at night, searched, and held for hours simply because he looked suspicious. A young woman tearfully recalled being mocked with cruel language just after leaving a corner store. Each testimony was a fresh wound to the community's already fragile trust, and they fueled the growing demand for complete accountability. In front of the police headquarters, activist groups erected large boards listing the names and stories of each victim. They called it the Wall of Truth, where anyone passing by could see the faces and hear the long-ignored voices. The image was streamed live across platforms and quickly spread worldwide. Many people, for the first time, realized this wasn't just an isolated incident, it was an entire system that had allowed misconduct to thrive without consequence. During public forums, analysts pointed out that Kane and Doyle's continued presence in the force, despite multiple complaints, was clear proof of a failed internal oversight process. They stated outright that the issue wasn't just with two individuals, but with the operational structure that had protected and enabled them. The question, who allowed this to continue, echoed relentlessly, forcing high-ranking officials to face the music. Aisha remained silent, but each time she appeared, the ring shining on her hand reminded everyone that the truth had broken through the wall of concealment. No one needed her to speak further, as the records and testimonies were enough to prove what she had implied from the very beginning. In the public's eyes, she had become a living witness to the fact that justice can be delayed, but it never disappears. As more victims came forward, the system became increasingly exposed. The investigations expanded, and even the officials who had once signed off to shelve the files were brought to light. Cracks in what was believed to be an unshakable wall now widened, and the entire structure had to face the reality that silence had fostered injustice. What began on a mountain road had turned into an indictment of an entire mechanism, and the public was determined not to let it end in compromise. Under intense public pressure, the city council could no longer afford to delay. An emergency meeting was held that very night. City Hall lit brightly as members rushed in with tense faces. A room once used for dry budget talks had now become a battlefield, where every word was recorded by the media and watched closely by the public. Pages flipped rapidly, pens tapped against wood, all sounds blending into a thick atmosphere ready to erupt. The council could no longer dodge the question, how to respond when the officer's misconduct was undeniable and public trust at its lowest. The discussion unfolded with overlapping voices, some calling for immediate suspension, others fearing that swift action might set a dangerous precedent. Yet the undeniable truth in the exposed records made any excuses feel hollow. A young council member stood up suddenly, voice shaking but firm, pointing directly at the report and declaring, "If this council hesitates any longer, the city will forfeit its right to govern." The room fell silent because no one dared to disagree. In the shadowed corner of the room, Aisha sat quietly. She didn't join the debate, nor did she offer an opinion. Her presence was like a concealed blade, still but sharp enough to weigh on every mind. The silver ring on her hand caught the overhead lights, casting a small reflection, yet it served as a constant reminder that justice was present. She didn't need to speak, because her silence alone was the force that pushed the council toward action. The atmosphere dragged on for hours, tense like a wire about to snap. Some veteran council members, long used to handling things internally, were forced to concede, realizing that this time, it couldn't end with empty promises. The more they looked at Aisha's silence, the more they understood that if they failed, that silence would turn into a decisive strike against the council's credibility. And when that happened, they wouldn't just lose public trust, they'd lose their positions altogether. As the meeting pushed past midnight, a final decision was reached. An independent, transparent, and public investigation would be launched, and Kane and Doyle would be immediately suspended pending its outcome. This decision wasn't just made to calm public outrage, but to affirm that the city would not tolerate abuse of power. The council members were exhausted, but in their eyes was a hint of relief, because at the very least, they had taken the necessary step to salvage what trust remained. Aisha remained seated, calm, her eyes reflecting quiet understanding. She didn't applaud or show joy, because she knew this was only the beginning. But with silence as sharp as a blade, she had pushed the council into urgency, forcing those who thrived on delay to strip away their layers of mutual protection. And in that moment, everyone could feel that justice was no longer an abstract idea, but was being carved into every decision, under the light reflected from the shimmering ring on her hand. On sentencing day, the central courthouse was packed. The once quiet hallways echoed with hurried footsteps and the constant clicking of cameras. People had lined up early, eager to get into the courtroom, knowing this moment would mark a pivotal point in the city's history. On the defendant's bench, Kane and Doyle sat side by side, their faces stiff, stripped of their usual arrogance. They looked down, hands clenched tightly, fully aware that no words they had spoken during the trial could undo the undeniable evidence now laid bare. The judge read the charges in a calm but weighty tone. Every word echoed through the courtroom, detailing the abuse of power, the exposed past violations, and the video that had become a historic piece of evidence. The court affirmed that Kane and Doyle had gravely violated their duty as law enforcers, turning authority into a weapon of humiliation and intimidation. When the words, "stripped of badges, immediate termination from all duties within the force," were spoken, the room erupted. Applause mixed with cheers filled the air, and tears ran down the faces of those who had waited far too long to see justice truly delivered. Kane looked up briefly, eyes bloodshot, then quickly lowered his head as cameras turned toward him. Doyle squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to block out the oncoming reality. For them, every excuse had collapsed, and this sentence not only ended their careers but branded them as symbols of failure, a clear warning to the entire system that abused power would be taken away. Marcus Hale sat in the witness section, his face vacant. When the court moved to announce the verdict involving him, the room fell silent. The judge's voice rang out, stating that Marcus, as an eyewitness at the scene, had not only failed to intervene but had enabled the abuse through his passive acceptance. His silence and mocking words had contributed to the wrongdoing. Though he wore no badge, he was still held socially and legally accountable. The court ordered him to pay significant damages for the emotional harm inflicted on Aisha and mandated his participation in a city-supervised community support fund. Marcus bowed his head, his hands trembling. The words of contempt he had once uttered on that mountain road replayed in his mind. He had thought himself merely a bystander. But today, the court made it clear that indifference was its own form of complicity. The sound of the judge's pen signing the verdict was like the final blow, shattering any effort to preserve his dignity. Those who once admired Marcus now looked at him with disdain, and his image spread across headlines as a stark reminder that wealth cannot conceal moral responsibility. As the verdict was announced, Aisha sat quietly in the gallery. She showed no sign of satisfaction or triumph, only kept her eyes steady on the judge's bench, calm and composed. To her, the sentence was not revenge, but a necessary step for justice to stand firm. That composure made Aisha's image even more vivid, a source of strength for all those who had ever been dismissed or demeaned. When the session ended, the applause carried on endlessly. People left the courthouse feeling lighter, as if a weight had finally been lifted. Evening headlines quickly rolled out with bold titles: "Badges stripped, justice restored." From that moment on, the city understood the ruling wasn't just for two officers and a businessman, but a message to the entire system. Truth may be delayed, but it will ultimately speak, loud and without compromise. At the moment the judge finished reading the verdict, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Many turned to one another with eyes shining, some even shedding tears, finally witnessing justice being named. But all were waiting for one thing: for the woman at the center of it all to speak. When Aisha was invited to address the court, the room fell into a hush so deep that even breaths could be heard. She stood tall, the silver ring on her hand gleaming under the ceiling lights, her eyes fixed on the judge and the panel. Her voice rang out, not loud, not shaky, just clear enough for all to hear. "I want justice, not revenge." That sentence, concise and sharp, sliced through the atmosphere like a blade. It wasn't gloating, nor was it resignation. It was a new definition of victory. For a few moments, the room was silent. No applause, no comments, as if everyone needed a pause to absorb each word. All eyes were on Aisha, full of admiration and emotion, realizing her strength lay not only in standing up to injustice, but in her refusal to let pain turn into hatred. Marcus bowed his head. Those words struck him harder than any verdict. He knew that if he had been in her place, he likely couldn't have spoken with such composure. Kane and Doyle sat farther back, their faces tense, but even in their eyes, there was a flicker of shame. They knew Aisha's words weren't aimed only at them, but at the entire system that had enabled their abuse for years. Then, from the back of the room, a round of applause began. At first, just one pair of hands. Then it spread like a wave, sweeping across the courtroom. The applause wasn't meaningless noise. It was agreement, gratitude for someone who had dared to speak for all. In that rising sound, people stood up, the gallery turning into a sea of bodies, all facing Aisha. Tears fell, some choked up, others smiled, everyone united in one resounding ovation. Aisha remained still, her eyes clear, showing no pride. She let the applause rise around her, neither raising her hand nor smiling, simply standing as a point of strength. The ring on her hand caught the light, and that glow, together with the sound of clapping, became the image captured by many journalists. Soon after, those photos spread with the caption, "Justice, not revenge." After the trial, reports flooded the media, but most didn't focus on the sentence or the compensation. Instead, they centered on Aisha's single statement. Commentators praised her composure, with many social analysts calling it a profound lesson for the entire legal system. People said it was that attitude that gave her power, because revenge only fuels more hatred, while justice is what can end the cycle of injustice. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted as Aisha stepped out. They chanted her name, holding up signs hastily written that morning: "Justice, not revenge." The air was charged like a festival, yet carried a solemn weight. Among the crowd were people who had once been victims of Kane and Doyle. They cried upon seeing Aisha, as if in her they found a voice for the pain they themselves had been unable to speak. Marcus slipped away quietly through the crowd, chased by the echo of applause and shouting. He knew he would be haunted by that day, not only because of the verdict, but because of a simple sentence that stripped bare the truth that dignity holds more weight than power or wealth. Kane and Doyle were led away, heads bowed, every step heavy with the sound of hundreds of hands confirming in unison that the age of tolerance for abuse was over. For those who were present that day, the clearest image was not the court's ruling, nor the confused faces of those who had failed, but Aisha's calm stance and her brief words. That sentence would be quoted for years to come, a guiding principle for anyone standing against injustice. And as the evening sun settled over the courthouse steps, the applause continued to echo, as if to mark that from that moment on, the city had entered a new chapter, one where justice is named through courage and compassion. Just one day after the verdict, international newspapers simultaneously ran the story. From Europe to Asia, bold headlines appeared on front pages. Aisha Ro's Ring of Justice. The articles opened with an image of her standing in the courtroom, the silver ring shining under the lights, accompanied by the brief but powerful quote, "I want justice, not revenge." That image was more than proof of a misconduct case. It became a message that crossed borders, forcing many countries to reflect on how their legal systems face truth and justice. On social media, the phrase numbered justice ring appeared in overwhelming numbers, quickly surpassing US borders to become a global trend. People used the hashtag not only to share Aisha's story, but their own experiences confronting injustice. A student in South Africa posted a photo of a hand wearing a cheap fake ring with the caption, "Justice lies in value, not in wealth." In Japan, a social advocacy group hung banners bearing the hashtag in front of the Tokyo courthouse. In France, young people painted the ring symbol on walls as a reminder that justice never disappears. International television networks launched segments discussing the Aisha Ro effect. Analysts said what made the story spread so powerfully was the combination of a simple image and a universal message. A ring, a single sentence, yet it stirred both the pain and hope of millions who had been ignored. They noted the case had moved beyond the legal realm and become a cultural symbol, proving that truth only needs one moment to ignite, but can resonate forever. In major cities, marches were held under the theme, "Justice Ring." Participants didn't chant hateful slogans, but carried signs printed with Aisha's words. They turned her story into fuel for movements demanding transparency, reform, and protection for the vulnerable. Images of thousands raising their hands with a black ink circle drawn on the ring finger spread everywhere, becoming a sign of unity. Marcus Hale watched all of it from his private home. He sat motionless in front of the screen, saying nothing, silently staring at the flood of hashtags. Every time Aisha's face appeared on international broadcasts, he felt his own smallness more clearly. The incident he once thought was just a roadside mishap had grown into a global movement, and he understood that he would forever be remembered not as a millionaire, but as the man who stood on the wrong side of justice. Meanwhile, Aisha kept her simple lifestyle. She avoided the press, gave no interviews, but that only made her image more powerful. Her silence prevented the story from getting lost in the noise and preserved its weight. People spoke of her not as a media star, but as a quiet symbol, letting the light from the ring tell the story for her. The hashtag number Justice Ring kept spreading, appearing in human rights campaigns across multiple countries. From a deserted mountain road, from a brief moment in time, Aisha's story crossed all borders, leaving its mark as a reminder that justice doesn't only exist in courtrooms, but in the hearts of those who dare to stand tall and speak the truth. As number Justice Ring went global, selected frames from the original video began appearing everywhere. Among them, the image of Aisha bent over, fixing the Bentley on the mountain road, her hand covered in grease, but the silver ring still gleaming, was seen as the most powerful symbol. That image was printed on posters, t-shirts, pasted on city walls, and even featured in photography exhibitions about moments that changed society. People didn't see it as a woman doing manual labor, but as proof of dignity, holding strong under pressure. Each time the image appeared, it reminded people that justice can be awakened from moments that seem ordinary. In the small town where the incident happened, the atmosphere had clearly shifted. Cafes that once only discussed crop seasons now buzzed with conversations about Aisha, the ring, and the trial. The mountain road was beginning to be viewed as a historical site. Visitors came to take photos where Aisha once stood against Kane and Doyle. A local photo shop even started offering wooden frames of the Aisha fixing the car image for curious tourists. But unlike cheap commercialization, each print came with a reminder. Don't forget, this is where justice was named. A group of young people in town launched a mural project. On a large wall near the town square, they painted Aisha leaning over the open hood, with light bursting from the ring behind her. The wall quickly became a gathering spot, with fresh flowers and candles placed in front of it daily. Children in the area were also told the story as an early life lesson that even small actions can ignite the truth. Moved by the growing impact, the town's authorities decided to host an official ceremony honoring Aisha. A stage was set up in the central square, and thousands of residents gathered, from elderly people who had witnessed many injustices in their lives to young people feeling community power for the first time. The atmosphere was both solemn and emotional, deep music echoing through the crowd's quiet chatter as they waited for the moment Aisha would step forward. When she appeared, the air erupted. Aisha walked calmly onto the stage, the ring on her hand now a global symbol. People chanted her name, the calls rising in waves across the square. Small flags printed with the ring emblem were handed out freely, thousands of hands raised in unison. That moment transformed an ordinary square into a glowing sea of solidarity. The town chairman spoke, his voice trembling but sincere through the microphone. He admitted that the town had once allowed abuse of power to exist in everyday life, that there were times when cries for help from the vulnerable were ignored. But thanks to that moment on the mountain road, and Aisha's unwavering resolve, the entire community had awakened. He announced the decision to award her the honorary title of Protector of Justice, a recognition never before granted in the town's history. Thunderous applause broke out, and people stood up, some in tears. Aisha held the certificate, her eyes calm, lips forming only a faint smile. She didn't give a long speech, only said that she hoped the town would remember justice doesn't lie in a person or a symbol, but in the actions of everyone. That sentence was instantly remembered, widely shared, and became a slogan seen in many photos taken after the ceremony. One moment from the event silenced everyone. A front row of seats had been reserved for those once victimized by Kane and Doyle. When Aisha stepped down from the stage, they stood one by one and embraced her like family. No words were needed. Those embraces spoke for every emotion. Spectators watching the scene wept, for they could clearly see that healing had begun right where harm once lived. International media recorded the ceremony, and that evening, images of Aisha standing in a square filled with light were broadcast around the world. Once again, she didn't need to say much, for her presence and steadfast actions had already turned her into a symbol. The townspeople became proud witnesses, telling how they had seen justice no longer as a distant concept, but something real, living in their own community. After the tribute, the small roads leading to the outskirts were decorated with ring emblems, and schools began incorporating her story into civics lessons. Aisha declined all privileges offered by the authorities, choosing instead to return to her modest home and resume her ordinary life. But to the town, from that day on, whenever they saw the flash of a silver ring, they were reminded not only of a single moment, but of an entire journey that brought justice back, beginning with the oil-stained hands of a woman who made the whole world listen. After the loud days stirred by court proceedings, international media, and celebratory ceremonies, Aisha chose to return to a simple rhythm of life in her small house on the outskirts of town. The familiar front yard, once again filled with the smell of gasoline and old mechanical tools, echoed with the familiar clicking of wrenches. Her old car, which had been with her for years, sat quietly under the tree, hood wide open, and Aisha, in a worn-out t-shirt, bent down, her hands greasy, working patiently on every small part. This scene was far removed from the image of her being cheered on stage or featured in radiant photographs, but it was the one closest to her true self, a life she had always wanted to preserve. That quiet afternoon, the sound of children's laughter echoed from the end of the alley. A group of neighborhood kids ran over, eyes wide as they saw Aisha working. They didn't see a global icon, only a familiar neighbor, yet the silver ring flashing on her hand instantly drew them in, curious as if spotting treasure. A curly-haired girl pointed at it, her round eyes hesitant as she asked, "Miss, is that ring real?" The question, innocent and direct, held the wonder and longing of childhood, when anything that sparkled carried a touch of magic. Aisha paused, wiped a smear of oil from her cheek, and sat down at eye level with the children. She held out her hand, the ring catching the afternoon light, casting a thin glint across their faces. "It's real," she said gently, "but the real value isn't here." The kids looked at one another, not fully grasping the meaning, but the admiration in their eyes was clear. A playful boy asked, "Does it have magic?" Aisha smiled and gave a small nod. "Yes, if you believe magic is standing up for what's right." The answer made the kids fall silent for a moment, then burst into laughter. A boy raised his hand as if taking an oath, and a girl lightly touched the ring, her eyes shining. To them, Aisha wasn't just the woman from the news, but living proof that something extraordinary could exist right there on their little street, where they played every day. As the children scattered, back to their games, Aisha returned to the old car. She tightened a few bolts, wiped down parts of the engine long forgotten. The clinks of metal blended with the birdsong of dusk, bringing a peace she hadn't felt during the stormy days. Deep down, Aisha knew the world outside was still noisy, still filled with debates, articles, and speeches tying her name to the story of justice. But here, in this small yard, she was only herself again, a woman who loved mechanics, simplicity, and silence. The elderly neighbor walked by, paused for a moment, then nodded at her with a gaze full of respect. He didn't say much, but that nod was enough for Aisha to understand that her presence had brought a quiet pride to the neighborhood. The people here didn't need flashy headlines to remember Aisha. They had seen it with their own eyes, and to them, she wasn't some distant symbol but a part of this small community. In a moment of rest, Aisha sat on the porch steps, her eyes following the last light of day stretching across the narrow street. She saw children running back and forth, their laughter echoing, blending with the rustle of wind through the trees. The ring on her hand shimmered, not from the glare of press cameras, but from the gentle light of the countryside sunset. She thought to herself, perhaps this is the most precious thing of all, the freedom to live in peace, to remind those around her that justice begins with everyday kindness. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Aisha stood up, packed away her tools, and closed the hood she had just adjusted. The old car gave a soft tremble, then started smoothly under her hand. The hum of the engine sounded like a welcome, making Aisha smile. She knew this car would never make a front page, or become a global icon, but it stood as proof of the simple life she wanted to hold on to. And in that moment, Aisha felt a calm settle in, as if she had finally found the balance between the world's admiration and her own quiet rhythm. Evening fell, the shine of the ring fading, but in Aisha's heart, peace still glowed brightly. She understood that the road ahead would be long, filled with more challenges and more questions. But she also knew this simplicity would be her foundation to move forward, steadier than any spotlight the public could offer. And when the children ran by again, shouting, "Miss Aisha is the best mechanic," she laughed, realizing that justice might sometimes begin with an innocent compliment like that. Aisha smiled gently as the children still gathered around, their eyes fixed on the shimmering ring in the fading light. She softly took the hand of the girl nearest her, raised her own hand so everyone could see clearly, then said slowly, "It's just a keepsake. What matters is that we know how to stand up." Her voice wasn't loud, but each word rang clear, making the kids fall silent, as if they had just heard something beyond their young understanding. They didn't fully grasp the meaning, but they felt the sincerity, and that sincerity was enough to plant a seed in their hearts. The children looked at one another, nodding, some smiling, some frowning in thought. A boy spoke up with certainty, "When I grow up, I'll stand up just like you." The others joined in, chanting together, creating a small echo across the yard. Aisha laughed, not with sarcasm, but with pure joy at seeing hope reflected in their innocent eyes. She understood that maybe she couldn't change everything out there, but she could plant belief in the next generation, and that was enough to warm her heart. After the children drifted away, their laughter fading into the distance, the yard returned to quiet. Aisha sat on the steps, her eyes gazing toward the narrow dirt path leading to the fields. The open space was filled with birdsong from the trees and the faint scent of dry grass carried by the evening breeze. She rested her hand on her knee, the ring still catching the light, though softened by the fading glow. She knew she had traveled a long road from being dismissed on a mountain path to becoming the center of global attention and finally finding her way back to this peace. It all felt like a full circle, neat and full of meaning. In the sky, the sun sank lower, casting an orange-red glow, scattering warm golden rays across rooftops, fences, and the old car still smelling faintly of gasoline. The familiar scenery seemed wrapped in a new layer of quiet beauty. The golden dusk bathed the small yard, turning it into a still painting, full of life. Aisha took a deep breath, letting the breeze, scented with earth and sky, flow through her hair. In that moment, she no longer heard the noise of public opinion, the chatter of the press, or the harsh sounds of the courtroom, only the rhythm of her own breathing, in sync with the breath of nature. She leaned her head back slightly, eyes closed, letting the sunset slip in through her eyelids. In her mind, old images flickered. Kane and Doyle's sharp voices, Marcus with folded arms, the crowd shouting slogans, the applause in the courtroom. But all of it quickly faded, dissolving into the soft gold of twilight. Only one feeling remained, the certainty that she had done the right thing, that she had not bowed to humiliation, and from that, a story had taken shape far beyond her own life. When she opened her eyes, Aisha saw a few neighbors walking by. They paused and nodded at her with warm eyes. She returned a gentle smile, no words needed understanding already lived in their gaze. Everyone knew her name was now tied to justice, yet she remained simply the woman next door, living simply, fixing cars in her small yard, and nurturing peace day by day. The sunset stretched further, the sun sinking behind the horizon. The distant fields turned a deep golden hue, rooftops bathed in bright light, slowly melted into shadow. Aisha sat still, watching the sky transform, letting time pass like a gentle stream. Inside, she knew tomorrow might bring more challenges. But this moment was a well-earned reward for everything she had endured, a reward not born from titles or glory, but from returning to her truest self. As night began to fall, the golden glow gave way to streaks of deep blue and violet. Aisha stood, brushed the dust off her shirt, and stepped inside. The door closed quietly behind her, but the small yard still held the last traces of sunlight. And there, the silver ring on her hand continued to shine softly, not to dazzle, but as a quiet reminder that justice had been lit and still lived on in the stillness of everyday life. One late afternoon, as the golden light stretched across the small road leading into town, Aisha was watering the wildflower beds in her yard when a strange car pulled up at the gate. It wasn't a luxury vehicle, just a modest sedan, but the person who stepped out was instantly recognizable. Marcus Hale, his suit wrinkled, his face more gaunt than the last time she had seen him in the courtroom. His steps were slow, heavy, as if every movement carried the weight of something unseen. When he reached the fence, he stopped, his trembling hand gripping the wooden rail, his voice hoarse as he said, "I was wrong the moment I opened my mouth." Aisha set the watering can down, gently wiping her damp hands, her eyes neither harsh nor eager to respond. She stood silent for a few seconds, letting the wind carry Marcus's words into the open air. Then, slowly, she stepped closer, facing him across the low fence, her voice clear but calm. "You wronged me and your own dignity." Her words landed like a mirror held up to the past, and Marcus lowered his head, his shoulders sagging. He knew it wasn't just a rebuke, but a truth he had been avoiding for far too long. Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes clouded with fatigue. He seemed about to say more, but his voice caught, stuck in his throat. At last, he sighed, both hands clenched tightly. "I used to think that staying silent that day was a way to preserve my dignity. But the longer time passed, the more I understood that silence was also a kind of complicity. I let my pride blind me, and now, here I am, standing in the aftermath." Each word fell like a stone, heavy, bitter. Aisha listened, her face unreadable. She didn't want Marcus to believe that a few words of apology could wash away everything, but she also understood how difficult it must be for a man who once stood at the peak of influence to now admit his wrongs to a woman he had once looked down on. "What I need," Aisha said, her tone steady, "isn't a late apology, but for you to truly reflect. If you understand anything, then live the rest of your life without turning away from injustice." Marcus looked up, a faint flicker of light in his eyes, as if her words had opened a narrow path out of his shame. He nodded, slowly but firmly. "I'll remember," he said. "I don't know if I can fix what's already happened, but I won't make the same mistake again." Then he stood still, not moving closer, not touching the gate. That distance felt like a boundary he understood he had no right to cross, not yet. The silence between them settled, broken only by the rustling leaves above and the sound of children's footsteps fading down the alley. Aisha took a breath, then quietly turned and stepped back into her yard, leaving Marcus standing outside. She didn't send him away, but she didn't invite him in either, because she knew forgiveness doesn't come from a handshake or a sentence. It takes time, it takes real action, and it takes Marcus proving it with the life he chooses from this moment on. Marcus stood for a few more minutes, eyes following Aisha's figure as she picked up the watering can and resumed her unfinished work. That image, simple yet steady, made something inside him sink. He realized that while he had been buried under public judgment and the collapse of his reputation, Aisha had reclaimed her peace, and it was that very peace that made him feel the emptiness within himself more clearly. At last, he turned quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, his figure slowly fading down the golden path of sunset. In the small yard, Aisha looked up at the sky, now deepening into violet. Marcus's late apology echoed in her mind, not sharply, but like a lingering sadness. She knew some mistakes could never be undone, but the willingness to face and admit them still held meaning. For her, what mattered wasn't what Marcus had said, but that she had remained steadfast, able to respond with a reminder not just for him, but for anyone who had ever forgotten their own dignity. That night, the light from Aisha's small home spilled into the yard, illuminating the wildflowers and the old car she had just finished repairing. Everything had returned to its familiar calm. Yet in that still moment, Aisha understood that the late apology, though it couldn't change the past, had closed an old chapter. And it was her unwavering stance that had forced someone once arrogant to bow his head and realize that justice doesn't only exist in a courtroom, but in how each person chooses to live after they've done wrong. Marcus stood motionless in front of the worn wooden gate, his eyes clouded by fatigue. In that moment, he no longer resembled the millionaire who once strode proudly through lavish parties. The suit on his back was now just a hollow shell, no longer able to hide the isolation within. The years of standing at the height of power had collapsed into the shape of a bent man, trembling under the weight of shame. Aisha had already gone inside, her figure blending with the soft yellow light, leaving him alone to face the emptiness he once tried to mask with wealth and fame. He stood still, no longer a millionaire. The arrogance in his eyes, the smug smile, all had vanished like mist under the fading twilight. What remained was a bare man, heavy with belated regret. Marcus felt each step he took as a burden, the road ahead seeming endless. Every movement a reminder of the day he chose silence over speaking up, the day he smirked instead of reaching out. He knew that choice hadn't just hurt Aisha, but had cracked the core of his own dignity. Silence covered the road. No car horns, no conversations. Only the sound of wind rustling through the trees and the echo of Marcus's footsteps, hurried, then hollow. The path leading back into town, once so familiar, now felt foreign, as if it too had turned its back on him. The sunset fell, casting gold over each stone, but for Marcus, The light brought no warmth, only highlighted the long, solitary shadow behind him. He realized that for the first time in years, he was no longer the center of attention, no longer sought after for advantage, but merely a lonely man left behind. With every step, Marcus thought of Aisha's words. "You wronged me, and your own dignity." That line rang like a bell in his mind, forcing him to confront the bare truth that wealth had never been a substitute for honor. He recalled the lavish parties, the million-dollar contracts, the handshakes and flattery that once surrounded him. Now, it all felt like an old film, stripped of its grip. The only thing that remained was the shame of knowing he had chosen to stand with the powerful at the cost of the truth. Night fell faster than he expected. Streetlights blinked on one by one, revealing a face drained of vitality. Passers-by glanced at him briefly, but none recognized Marcus Hale, once a millionaire. He had become anonymous in the indifferent gaze of strangers. It made him feel small, yet also brought an undeniable truth. The mask of reputation had fallen, and he was left to live as the person underneath. Down the long road, silence stretched like a binding thread. Marcus could hear the pounding of his own heart, each beat echoing into the vast emptiness. He didn't know where he was going, or what he would do next, but one image stayed vivid in his mind. Aisha, in her yard, oil-stained hands, the ring gleaming, eyes calm but sharp as a blade. That image made him realize justice doesn't need the mercy of the wealthy. It exists on its own, stands firm on its own, and will punish anyone who turns away. Marcus paused, took a deep breath. He looked up at the star-filled sky, light glittering above, but inside he felt only emptiness. "I was wrong," he whispered, not for Aisha to hear, but for himself. The admission wouldn't erase what had been done, but at least it let him face the truth. He knew from this day on, the road ahead would no longer be paved with admiration, but would stretch out in long steps toward redemption. Back on the main street, the noise returned from restaurants and late-night shops. But to Marcus, the bustle only deepened his loneliness. He walked slowly through it all, hearing laughter, the everyday sounds of life, and feeling how far he had drifted. He no longer belonged to the lavish world of the rich, but hadn't yet found a place in this quieter one either. All that remained was a hovering emptiness, a space where he would have to keep walking alone. The road remained wrapped in silence, a silence within him and from the world around. But this time, Marcus felt it was no longer just loneliness, but a chance. That silence forced him to listen to himself, to admit that change had to begin from within, not from any title or name he once carried. And in that moment, he knew that even now, late as it was, he still had a choice: to keep hiding behind the shell of his past, or to walk forward in quiet and learn how to reclaim the dignity he had lost. His shadow faded into the dark, leaving behind the dimly lit street, where silence lay thick like a heavy curtain. But in that silence, something new had begun to take shape. A man once full of pride now learning to bow his head, a millionaire once arrogant now stripped bare. And even though each step remained heavy, somewhere in Marcus's mind stirred a faint desire one day. He would no longer walk through silence to escape, but to return to a truth more peaceful than before. The following month, at a formal press conference held at the Rowe Corporation headquarters, the new leadership announced the establishment of the Aisha Rowe Scholarship Fund. The announcement rang out beneath a burst of flashbulbs, silencing the room for a moment before it erupted into applause. The scholarship is dedicated to students from disadvantaged backgrounds who persist in the pursuit of knowledge, with an emphasis that it was created not just to honor a story of justice, but to nurture generations who know how to stand tall and never bow to injustice. Behind the podium, bold letters read, "Justice is legacy," a reminder that Aisha's story didn't end in a single moment, but had become a legacy tied to the future. The company's spokesperson explained that the idea for the fund was born from the wave of impact following the trial. They realized that public response had moved beyond outrage toward a desire for lasting change. The scholarship, therefore, was built as a bridge between the pursuit of justice and the investment in education, because knowledge is the only true foundation to prevent injustice from repeating itself. The message was met with enthusiasm, and many other companies pledged contributions, turning the fund into a broad social movement. Aisha was not present at the announcement, but her name was everywhere. International headlines read, "From the Ring of Justice to the Aisha Rowe Scholarship Fund." Journalists wrote that her story had gone far beyond one incident, becoming a symbol that sparked change. At universities, students shared news of the scholarship as motivation, reminding each other that every small action today could be the foundation of a more just tomorrow. Meanwhile, on another front, the local police system was forced to undergo sweeping reform. After the verdict and the continued public pressure, city officials mandated that the entire force participate in new training on human rights and civic conduct. Classes were held continuously, featuring independent experts, attorneys, and even victims of past abuses. Officers were made to sit and listen to painful stories they had once ignored, forced to confront the reality that a uniform is not a shield, but a responsibility to protect. News outlets reported scenes of hundreds of officers sitting in auditoriums, heads bowed, as a black woman recounted being stopped without cause. Those images spread quickly, and for the first time, the public began to believe that reform might be taken seriously. Some younger officers stood to speak, admitting they had never received proper training on human rights, and that the course helped them recognize deep-rooted failures. Though doubts remained, this first step showed that the system had finally begun to change. Aisha, in her quiet solitude, followed the news from afar. She made no public comments, but her eyes lit up as she watched the images. To her, legacy was not about having her name praised, but about real, lasting change, so that future generations would not have to face what she once did. She knew the scholarship fund and training programs were just the beginning, but that beginning carried hope, and that hope was enough to sow seeds for seasons of justice to come. In the town's schools, teachers began incorporating Aisha's story into their lessons, not just as an incident, but as a way to teach dignity and how to confront injustice. Posters showing her fixing a car, the ring on her hand glinting, now hung in libraries, with the caption, "Strength begins with truth." Children looked at it and didn't see a distant icon, but a neighbor, someone who stood up, and that lesson quietly rooted itself in their young minds as a lifelong reminder. At a higher level, international conferences on judicial reform and social equity began referencing the Aisha Rowe effect. Scholars analyzed how the story underscored the power of individuals speaking out. They argued that justice cannot be upheld through silence, and that systems only change when those within them stop compromising. These studies were printed in academic journals, placing Aisha's name in the pages of modern history. Marcus Hale, from the shadows of what remained of his life, read those headlines with conflicting emotions. He knew he would always be remembered as someone who stood on the wrong side, but he also saw in it a faint comfort. At least from his failure, something meaningful had emerged. Though he was no longer an admired millionaire, he understood that he had, however unintentionally, helped push change forward, and that became the only reason he could keep moving on. As for Aisha, watching the sunset cast gold across her rooftop, she gently touched the ring, feeling the coolness of the metal. To her, legacy did not lie in praise, but in a society shifting, in classroom doors opening to poor children, in the change she saw in the eyes of police officers, now forced to relearn respect for humanity. That legacy did not belong to her alone, but to everyone who had ever faced injustice and still chose to stand. And so, the small town, once known only for a narrow mountain road, now appeared on world maps as the starting point of a movement. Life there continued quietly, but beneath it all was a lasting pride that they had witnessed a moment of transformation. Aisha's story didn't end in applause. It became a bridge leading the entire community into a new era, where justice was no longer just a concept, but a legacy gradually taking shape in every action, in every person. At market gatherings or in small coffee shops, the townspeople often retold the story as a shared memory. They usually began with a simple but weighty phrase, "A quiet road changed the whole system." Every time those words were spoken, listeners would nod, recalling the afternoon when exhaust smoke rose on the mountain road, and the moment Aisha faced humiliation. From the initial silence, to the glint of light from the ring, then to the moment the entire system was forced to bow its head, all of it was etched into the town's memory, as proof that this small place had sparked a far-reaching change. Residents passed the story to their children, not just as a moral lesson, but as a piece of heritage, so they'd understand that justice can begin in places no one notices. Journalists returned to the town, interviewing locals and recording their simple but resonant accounts. An elderly former miner stated firmly that he had never believed the system could change until he saw the crowd rise to support Aisha. A young mother holding her child said she wanted her child to grow up in a world that respects dignity, and that from that quiet road, she now believed it was possible. These accounts were published as feature stories, putting the small town in the headlines not for chaos, but because it had become a symbol of transformation. Yet amid all the buzz, Aisha chose to retreat behind the door of peace. She didn't appear at international forums, didn't attend honorary galas, and declined every offer to commercialize her image. To her, living simply was the only way to preserve the true value of what had happened. People still saw her fixing the old car in her small yard, still saw her reading on the porch each afternoon, still saw her at the market buying wildflowers for her living room. Everything remained simple, no different from before, except the eyes around her now held deep respect. Some persistent reporters sought her out, hoping for interviews, but Aisha only smiled and declined. She said the story had already been told, and her life didn't need further display. That very quietness made her image even more compelling. People saw and understood that she wasn't seeking the spotlight, but seeking balance. That was also the strongest message. Justice isn't a dazzling stage, but an honest way of living every day. Within the community, Aisha's choice was fully respected. The townspeople didn't intrude, letting her live the life she had chosen, though in their hearts, everyone regarded her with pride. Children passing her house still occasionally called her name out loud, as a sign of admiration. Adults quietly agreed that if anyone asked about this town, the first story they'd tell would be about Aisha. She didn't need to stand in the town square to be applauded, because every respectful glance from a neighbor was the most lasting recognition of all. On quiet evenings, the light from Aisha's small house still glowed modestly, blending into the darkness of the town. There was no noise, no pursuit from the media, only the steady rhythm of a peaceful life. Yet, from that very stillness, people could clearly feel the greatness of a legacy. Aisha had chosen to step away from the whirlwind of spotlights that justice wouldn't be turned into a tool for fame, but would retain its original purity. And whenever someone repeated that, a quiet road changed the whole system, everyone understood the story was still ongoing, not in grand halls, but in the small yard where Aisha lived, in the simplicity she preserved, and in the belief that justice doesn't live in the flash of cameras, but in the quiet resolve of someone who stands up at the right moment. That legacy, Aisha never kept for herself, but allowed it to spread in enduring silence, forcing the world to remember it, not through noise, but through quiet respect. The narrator closes the journey with a simple truth. Justice is not a distant concept written in law books or hung on formal plaques, but begins with small actions. With the moment, an ordinary person dares to stand tall and speak up when disrespected. That empty mountain road was just a quiet backdrop, the broken-down car just a random mishap, but it was those small actions from Aisha's hands bent over the engine to her calm eyes when facing humiliation that opened a door no one expected. From that moment, the entire system had to take a hard look at itself. Society had to reflect in the mirror, and justice found its true voice. The ring only revealed the truth, but courage is what made justice real. If Aisha had remained silent that day, if she had accepted the humiliation and let everything pass, then the flash from the ring would have meant nothing. What made the ring a symbol was never its material value, but the fact that it was lifted by a steady hand, by a woman who dared to challenge those wearing badges of authority. That courage turned a piece of jewelry into evidence, turned a moment of humiliation into an indictment of an entire system, and turned an ordinary person into a living legacy of justice. The lesson is not just for those in a small town, but for anyone who has ever felt small in the face of injustice. Strength doesn't come from status or wealth, but from the decision not to turn away from the truth. People often believe justice is born in courtrooms, in laws, but Aisha's story reminds us that it also comes from every small choice in life, from how we treat each other, from whether or not we dare to defend fundamental values. Sometimes, a nod, a brief objection, or one step forward is enough to shift the course of everything. That story is also a warning to those who hold power. Power may create temporary silence, but it cannot stop the light of truth. Kane and Doyle once believed a few insults would be forgotten, that their authority would go unchallenged, but the video and the glint of a ring exposed everything, and they lost it all. Marcus thought his wealth and position would shield him, but it was his silence and contempt that made him proof of complicity. The story reminds us that anyone who disrespects another's dignity will ultimately be forced to bow before justice. Meanwhile, Aisha continues on her path without needing the spotlight. She doesn't make herself a symbol through speeches, but lets her actions tell the story. It is that simplicity that keeps the lesson pure, untainted by personal ambition. People look to her to see that justice is not a stage for display, but a way of living each day. The peace in her small house, the laughter of neighborhood children, the glint of the ring in the sunset, all of it becomes proof that the greatest justice is simply living with honesty and grace. Today, when people speak of the justice ring, they are not just referring to a piece of jewelry from the Rowe family, but to a source of inner strength. Schools include the story in their civics curriculum as a lesson in citizenship, and international conferences analyze it as a case study in the reversal of power dynamic. But beyond all the analysis, the core lesson remains unchanged. Justice begins with a small act, with one person choosing to hold on to their dignity even when surrounded by contempt and oppressive authority. And when night falls over the town, the soft yellow light glowing from the small house where Aisha lives continues to remind everyone, justice does not lie in noise, but in quiet resolve. It does not vanish when the flashlights turn off, but lives on in each person's daily choices. The ring will always be a symbol, but it is courage that becomes a lasting legacy. And that legacy, Aisha left not through slogans, but through her resolve to rise, at the moment it mattered most, proving that justice is not distant. It lives in hands that hold firm and eyes that dare to meet the truth. As the story comes to a close, Its echoes ripple outward, like waves that never stop. Society is forced to look at itself, from robed officials in courtrooms to officers patrolling the streets, from those once indifferent to injustice to those long accustomed to standing with the powerful. That mirror isn't made of glass, built from images. Aisha leaning over a broken car, the flash of the ring at sunset, the crowd shouting outside the courthouse, and the strong silence she held during key moments. When people look into it, they don't just see Aisha's story, they see the question meant for themselves. When faced with injustice, will we stay silent or speak out? Public institutions hold forums where the conclusion is clear. The fault didn't lie only with the two officers who abused their power, but with a system that tolerated it for too long. Schools include the lesson in civics classes, asking students to debate personal responsibility within a community. Even major corporations reflect on their role, realizing that wealth or prestige does not excuse them from accountability, and they begin to talk about new ethical standards. It's as if society now stands before a giant mirror where no one can look away. In everyday conversations, people recall Aisha's words as reminders. At a cafe, a man leans on the table and tells his friend, "We can't wait for justice to be handed to us. We have to live in a way that makes it real every day." In classrooms, teachers ask students, "What would you do if you saw someone being treated unfairly?" And the class falls silent for a moment, then hands slowly rise. These small moments show that society is truly beginning a process of reflection, not to assign blame, but to seek change. In major cities, murals began to appear, depicting the moment the ring flashed. Below each mural, a simple phrase was written, "Justice isn't lost, it shines when least expected." That phrase became the slogan of a new movement, echoed not just in banners but in everyday conversations between people. It was no longer poetic language, but a truth proven over time. Justice may be buried, it may be delayed, but it never disappears, and it returns at the most unexpected moment, like a light piercing through darkness. Writers, journalists, and even musicians found inspiration in the story. A song was written, its lyrics mentioning the light from a grease-stained hand, and it quickly became an anthem sung during peaceful marches. A collection of essays was published, arguing that justice is not merely a legal concept, but a moral choice made by individuals. All centered around one simple truth: justice isn't lost, it shines when least expected. Aisha, from her small yard, saw these waves unfold through the news and social media. She didn't step out to claim the spotlight, nor did she try to control how others told the story. She simply kept living simply, but in the way her eyes occasionally turned toward the evening sky, there was a quiet satisfaction. Because she knew what she had done didn't just change her own fate, but planted a seed in society's conscience, forcing it to reflect and change on its own. The children who once asked about the ring now knew the phrase by heart. They played outside, shouting, "Justice isn't lost, it shines when least expected." Their voices rang out like a future chorus. Parents overheard them and smiled, knowing that it was this new generation that truly carried Aisha's legacy. Not fanfare, not titles, but a renewed awareness planted in each heart. And as the sun set again over the town, casting golden light across the old mountain road where exhaust once filled the air, the phrase returned to everyone's mind. Justice isn't lost. It had once shone on an afternoon that seemed ordinary. It had brought down an entire system so it could be rebuilt with fairness, and it would continue to shine in places no one expected through quiet but decisive acts. The story closes, but the lesson remains, like a mirror that keeps reflecting, reminding each of us that we are responsible for keeping justice present, so that when the moment comes, it will shine again, unexpected and undeniable. The story began on a quiet mountain road with a stalled silver Bentley, with the arrival of Aisha Rowe, a humble black woman carrying a toolbox, and with the contempt of Marcus Hale, a white millionaire used to living under glamorous lights. The harsh words at first, the mocking laughter from officers Kane and Doyle, all seemed like a trivial moment in an ordinary life, but that very instant triggered a chain of events that shook an entire system. The flash of light from the silver ring on Aisha's hand became a turning point not because of its material worth, but because it revealed a truth that dignity cannot be buried. From being dismissed, Aisha stood her ground, unfazed by humiliation or threats. Each of her calm responses, each steady glance, began to shake those who thought they held all the power. Marcus, who initially chose silence to save face, was eventually forced to witness the shift. Kane and Doyle, once in control, became the face of blatant abuse of power when the video went public. And from there, the incident moved beyond a roadside dispute, becoming a wave of public outcry that forced society to pause and reflect. The strength of justice didn't come from force, but from a truth that was recorded, shared, and impossible to deny. The clip showing the bright ring and Aisha's resolute warning became undeniable evidence that left millions stunned. The hashtag #JusticeRing spread across social media, crossing not just the town's limits but national borders. People marched, journalists reported en masse, and the system was compelled to launch an investigation. Public pressure turned the event into an irreversible turning point. Hearings, trials, and press conferences all pointed to one undeniable truth. Justice can be delayed, but it cannot be hidden forever. Kane and Doyle were exposed, with a trail of past misconduct brought to light. Marcus faced judgment for his indifference and complicity. The city council was forced to confront systemic failure, and above all, Aisha stood present, quietly, with no slogans, only a powerful silence that made everyone look inward. What made this journey a legacy wasn't just the verdict, but the real changes that followed. The Roe Corporation established a scholarship fund in Aisha's name, supporting young people who pursue knowledge and justice. The police system was required to relearn human rights, forcing every officer to listen to the stories of past victims. Schools incorporated Aisha's story into lessons, teaching students the power of individual action. Townspeople proudly recounted how an empty road sparked a systemic change. And all around the world, the image of Aisha bent over a broken car, hands stained with oil and a ring that shimmered, became a symbol of dignity. What stands out is that Aisha never made herself a media star. She rejected the spotlight, returned to her small house, kept fixing her old car, watering her garden, and chatting with neighborhood kids. Yet it was this simplicity that made her image even clearer. People came to realize that justice doesn't need grand stages. It exists in the way we live each day. Aisha's calmness was the answer to it all. Victory isn't about applause. It's about holding on to dignity in every circumstance. Marcus Hale, once arrogant, was no longer a celebrated millionaire. His belated apology to Aisha showed that even those who once stood at the top can recognize their mistakes when they face themselves. His hunched figure on the twilight road stood as proof that pride, when misplaced, becomes a burden. And from that downfall, society learned an important lesson. Silence, in the face of injustice, is also a form of complicity. The final lesson left behind is exactly what the narrator emphasized. Justice begins with small actions. The ring was merely a piece of evidence that exposed the truth, but without Aisha's courage, it would have remained a meaningless accessory. It was her strength that turned the ring into a symbol, transformed a small roadside incident into a global movement, and made an ordinary woman a living legacy of justice. This story is a reminder that justice never disappears. It shines when least expected. It can be sparked by a firm word, by the light from a ring, or by a small act from a determined person. But when it ignites, it can illuminate an entire system, move millions of hearts, and become a legacy that endures across generations. That is the deeper meaning of Aisha's journey. Anyone can light the flame of justice, as long as they dare to stand and refuse to back down in the face of darkness.